Welcome to the Book of Judges, the most violent and disturbing book found in the Bible that most Christians choose to avoid reading. But concealed within these dark narratives is one of the most important messages God desires us to understand about human nature, about leadership, and about what occurs when people do what seems right in their own eyes. Get ready for a journey through Israel's darkest period that will transform how you see both God's justice and His mercy. If you're new to this channel, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Your support means a lot. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. We're building a global community here. So, without further ado, let's begin, shall we? The land without a leader. Picture a nation standing at the edge of a cliff, uncertain which way to turn. Joshua has passed away, taking with him the last memory of Moses and the wilderness wanderings. The man who led Israel across the Jordan River and conquered Jericho now rests in the hill country of Ephraim. His death marks more than the end of a life. It signals the beginning of chaos. The Israelites find themselves scattered across the promised land like sheep without a shepherd. Each tribe settles into its assigned territory, but something vital has been lost. The unified voice that once echoed from Mount Sinai grows fainter with each passing season. The clear commands that guided their fathers through 40 years of desert wandering become whispers in the wind. Without Joshua's steady hand, the 12 tribes begin to drift. Each group faces its own battles, makes its own choices, follows its own path. The Canaanite cities that Joshua left unconquered suddenly seem less like temporary obstacles and more like permanent neighbors. Compromise becomes easier than conflict. Tolerance replaces total obedience. This drift creates a pattern that will define the next 3 centuries of Israel's story. The people abandon their covenant with God, drawn away by the fertility gods of Canaan and the promise of easier living. Foreign oppression follows like night follows day. Mesopotamians, Moabites, Midianites, Philistines, each taking their turn to crush Israel beneath their heel. The oppression grows so heavy that even the most stubborn hearts cry out to heaven for help. God responds by raising up judges, not courthouse officials, but military leaders touched by divine spirit. These deliverers rally the tribes, defeat the oppressors, and restore peace to the land. For a generation, sometimes 2, Israel enjoys rest. Then the cycle begins again as the next generation forgets their father's God and their grandfather's slavery. The Book of Judges presents these stories not as a timeline, but as a spiral staircase descending into darkness. Each judge faces greater internal corruption than the last. Each victory costs more than the previous one. Each period of peace grows shorter and more fragile. At the center of every chapter stands one haunting refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This isn't the freedom of choice. This is the anarchy of abandoned responsibility. When every person becomes their own authority, when every tribe writes its own law, when every family decides its own truth, the result isn't liberty, but chaos. The stakes could not be higher. This isn't a children's tale of heroes and villains with happy endings guaranteed. This is the story of a chosen people losing their way, a covenant nation forgetting its purpose, a light to the world slowly dimming until it nearly goes out. The promised land becomes a testing ground where faith battles doubt, obedience wrestles with rebellion, and hope struggles against despair. More than conquest narratives or biographical sketches, these accounts reveal the human heart in all its complexity. They show what happens when people try to serve God on their own terms rather than His. They demonstrate how quickly blessing can turn to curse when gratitude gives way to presumption. The Book of Judges refuses to offer simple answers or comfortable conclusions. Instead, it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about leadership, faithfulness, and the cost of spiritual compromise. It asks whether any nation can survive when its people lose their moral center. It wonders aloud whether human nature is capable of sustained obedience to divine authority. These stories unfold in a land caught between promise and fulfillment, between conquest and settlement, between the God of their fathers and the gods of their neighbors. The geography itself tells the story. Highland strongholds where faith endures, valley settlements where compromise flourishes, border regions where cultures clash and blend. The judges themselves embody this tension. They are neither kings nor priests, neither fully human nor fully divine agents. They stand in the gap between heaven and earth, between God's perfect will and human imperfection, between the ideal of theocracy and the reality of fallen leadership. As we enter their world, we discover that their struggles mirror our own. Their temptations echo through history. Their failures warn us about roads we shouldn't travel. Their victories remind us that God can work through anyone, anywhere, at any time, even in the darkest seasons of human experience. The land without a leader becomes a mirror, reflecting every generation that has ever wondered where God has gone and whether his promises still hold true. In Israel's confusion, we see our own uncertainty. In their cycles of rebellion and restoration, we recognize patterns that persist across centuries and cultures. Tribes at war. Judah takes the lead. The dust from Joshua's funeral has barely settled when the tribes gather to ask the question that will define their future. Who shall go up first to fight against the Canaanites? The answer comes with divine authority. Judah shall take the lead. This moment carries weight beyond military strategy. It establishes a precedent that will echo through Israel's history for 1,000 years. Judah doesn't march alone. The tribe forms an alliance with Simeon, their smaller neighbor, whose inheritance lies within Judah's borders. Together they advance into the hill country, ready to complete what Joshua had begun. The partnership seems blessed from the start. Their combined forces sweep through the highlands like fire through dry grass. At Bezek, they encounter their first major test. A Canaanite king named Adoni-Bezek commands a force that should overwhelm the Israelite warriors. Yet, something supernatural tips the scales. The enemy breaks and flees, leaving their leader to face capture and humiliation. Adoni-Bezek's thumbs and big toes are cut off, rendering him unable to grip weapons or run in battle, a brutal but strategic decision that mirrors the ancient law of proportional justice. The fallen king recognizes divine judgment in his fate. 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, he admits. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Even enemies acknowledge that Israel's victories flow from heavenly sources rather than human strength. Jerusalem falls next, though the conquest remains incomplete. The city burns, but the Jebusites retain control of the fortress that will one day become David's capital. This partial victory foreshadows a pattern that will plague every tribal campaign. Initial success, followed by compromise and incomplete obedience. Judah presses southward into their inheritance, driving out the giants that had terrified the previous generation of spies. The sons of Anak, those legendary warriors who had seemed invincible 40 years earlier, crumble before men who trust in God's promises rather than their own strength. Hebron and Deborah fall in succession, fulfilling pledges made decades earlier. The conquest of Deborah brings a touching family story into the larger narrative. Caleb offers his daughter Aksah in marriage to whoever captures the city. Othniel, Caleb's nephew, accepts the challenge and wins both the city and the bride. When Aksah rides to her new home, she asks her father for additional wells to water the dry land he has given her as a dowry. Caleb grants her request, providing both upper and lower springs. This small act of generosity will prove prophetic. Othniel will become Israel's first judge. Yet, even Judah's early victories contain seeds of future trouble. The tribe successfully drives enemies from the hill country, but fails to conquer the valley settlements where iron chariots give the Canaanites military advantage. This partial obedience becomes a pattern that spreads like infection through the other tribes. Benjamin fails to drive the Jebusites from Jerusalem, the same city that Judah had burned, but not fully conquered. The two tribes' incomplete victories create a Canaanite stronghold in the very heart of the Promised Land. What should have been Israel's capital remains in enemy hands for generations. Manasseh proves unable or unwilling to drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean, Tanakh, Dor, Iblim, and Megiddo. These strategic cities control the major trade routes through northern Israel. Instead of conquest, Manasseh chooses coexistence, putting the Canaanites to forced labor when Israel grows strong enough to do so. Ephraim follows the same pattern at Giza. Rather than complete the difficult work of total conquest, they allow the Canaanites to remain as tribute-paying subjects. The arrangement seems practical, even profitable, but it violates the clear commands given through Moses and Joshua. Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali each find their own reasons to compromise. Some lack the military strength for total conquest. Others discover that Canaanite neighbors make useful trading partners. A few simply grow weary of constant warfare and seek accommodation over confrontation. Each compromise seems reasonable in isolation. Each partial victory looks like progress. Each decision to spare enemy populations appears merciful rather than disobedient. Yet, together, these choices create a web of spiritual and political complexity that will strangle Israel's future. The Canaanites who remain don't simply vanish into the landscape. They retain their gods, their customs, their ways of thinking about life and death and meaning. More dangerous still, they possess agricultural knowledge that the former wilderness wanderers desperately need. The Israelites must learn to work the land, to plant and harvest, to manage vineyards and olive groves. This practical dependence creates spiritual vulnerability. The Canaanite fertility gods promise rain for crops, conception for flocks, prosperity for families. When the harvest fails or the rains don't come, the temptation grows to hedge religious bets by offering sacrifices to local deities alongside the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The stage is set for the confrontation that will define the age of judges. Israel has gained the land, but not conquered it completely. They possess the promise, but not the full inheritance. They know God's power, but not God's heart. They remember his miracles, but not his moral demands. Othniel, Ehud, and the bloody left hand of deliverance. 8 years of servitude to Mesopotamian oppression teaches Israel a lesson their fathers had learned repeatedly in the wilderness. Disobedience brings consequences. The nation that had conquered giants now bows beneath the yoke of Cushan-Rishathaim, a king whose name means doubly wicked. The irony cuts deep. The people who had been delivered from Egyptian slavery find themselves enslaved again, this time in their own promised land. When their cries finally reach heaven, God responds by raising up Othniel, son of Kenaz and nephew of faithful Caleb. The choice seems almost nostalgic, a return to the generation that had trusted God completely. Othniel carries in his blood the memory of wilderness wanderings and the faith that had conquered Debir for love. He represents what Israel could become if they remembered their identity as God's chosen people. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Othniel with power that transforms him from clan leader to national deliverer. This divine anointing becomes the distinguishing mark of every judge, not political appointment or inherited authority, but supernatural empowerment for supernatural tasks. Under this anointing, Othniel rallies the scattered tribes and marches against the Mesopotamian oppressor. The war that follows receives little detail in the biblical account, but its outcome speaks volumes. Cushan-Rishathaim falls before the renewed power of united Israel. His armies scatter, his governors flee, his tribute collectors disappear into the night. The doubly wicked king discovers that no earthly power can stand against heaven's chosen champion. 40 years of peace follow Othniel's victory. An entire generation grows up knowing security rather than oppression, prosperity rather than tribute, hope rather than despair. Yet when Othniel dies, the familiar pattern reasserts itself. The people who have known only peace forget the God who gave it to them. They drift toward the gods of their Canaanite neighbors, seeking blessing from fertility deities rather than the Lord of hosts. This spiritual adultery triggers the second cycle of judgment and deliverance. God strengthens Eglon, king of Moab, giving him power to oppress Israel for 18 long years. The oppression comes not from distant Mesopotamia this time, but from across the Jordan River, from the descendants of Lot, who should have remembered their kinship with Abraham's family. Eglon forms an alliance with the Ammonites and Amalekites, ancient enemies who seize this opportunity to reclaim territory and exact revenge. Together, they cross the Jordan and capture Jericho, the city of palms that had fallen so miraculously to Joshua's army. The symbolic violation stings as much as the practical loss. Israel's greatest victory becomes the seed of foreign domination. The tribute system Eglon establishes drains Israel's wealth while funding Moabite expansion. Year after year, the choicest produce of the Promised Land flows eastward across the Jordan. Israel grows poorer while their oppressors grow fat on stolen prosperity. The metaphor becomes literally true in Eglon's case. The Moabite king grows so obese that his very appearance symbolizes his consumption of Israel's resources. When Israel's cries for deliverance finally move heaven to action, God's choice of deliverer surprises everyone. Ehud, son of Gera, comes from the tribe of Benjamin, the smallest and seemingly least significant of Israel's tribes. More unusual still, Ehud is left-handed, a trait considered unlucky or even cursed in ancient cultures, where the right hand symbolized blessing and honor. Yet God delights in using the unlikely and unexpected. Ehud's left-handedness becomes the key to his success as an assassin. Guards expect weapons to be carried on the left side and drawn with the right hand. A left-handed warrior can conceal a blade on his right thigh, hidden beneath his robes, where no one thinks to search. Ehud crafts a special weapon for his mission, a double-edged dagger about 18 inches long. He straps it to his right thigh and covers it with his cloak, then joins the tribute delegation, traveling to Eglon's court in Jericho. The irony deepens. Israel's future deliverer walks into the enemy capital, carrying the means of liberation hidden beneath the symbols of subjugation. The audience with King Eglon unfolds with careful protocol. Ehud presents the tribute with proper ceremony, demonstrating the respect due to a sovereign from his vassal. Yet after the formal presentation concludes and the other delegates depart, Ehud requests a private audience. He claims to carry a secret message for the king's ears alone. Eglon's curiosity overcomes his caution. He dismisses his guards and receives Ehud in his private chamber, a cool room on the upper floor where the afternoon heat cannot reach. The king's obesity requires him to remain seated, making him vulnerable to attack, but also making any assault more difficult and dangerous. "I have a message from God for you," Ehud declares as he approaches the seated monarch. Eglon rises respectfully at the mention of deity, perhaps the last respectful act of his life. As the king stands, Ehud draws his hidden dagger with his left hand and drives it deep into Eglon's massive belly. The blade disappears completely into the king's flesh, swallowed by layers of fat that close around the wound and trap the weapon inside. The graphic details serve a purpose beyond sensationalism. They demonstrate how thoroughly God's judgment penetrates even the most seemingly protected targets. No amount of wealth, power, or physical protection can shield the wicked from divine justice. Ehud locks the chamber doors behind him and escapes through the porch, walking calmly past confused servants who assume their master is attending to private business in the cool chamber. The delay before discovery gives Ehud time to reach the hill country and sound the call to rebellion. By the time Eglon's body is found, Israel's army is already mobilizing for war. The psychological impact of the assassination spreads faster than news of the king's death. Moabite confidence shatters when their seemingly invincible leader falls to a single Israelite warrior. Ehud seizes the moment, leading his forces to capture the fords of the Jordan and prevent Moabite reinforcements from crossing into Canaan. The battle that follows results in total victory for Israel. Not one Moabite warrior escapes across the Jordan. The army that had oppressed God's people for 18 years lies lifeless in the dust of the promised land. Moab's power over Israel dies with Eglon in that upper chamber in Jericho. 80 years of peace follow Ehud's victory, double the rest period that followed Othniel's triumph. Perhaps the more dramatic nature of the deliverance creates a more lasting memory. Perhaps the graphic details of God's judgment serve as a more effective warning against future apostasy. Or perhaps the second generation simply needs more time to forget the lessons their fathers learned through suffering. Shamgar, Deborah, and the Song of the Sword. Between the great deliverances, a brief notice appears like lightning across a dark sky. Shamgar, son of Anath, kills 600 Philistines with an ox goad, a wooden staff tipped with iron used to prod stubborn cattle. The weapon seems almost comically inadequate for such carnage, yet in the hands of a man touched by divine power, it becomes an instrument of salvation. Shamgar's victory carries special significance because it targets the Philistines, sea peoples who have begun settling along Canaan's coastal plain. These newcomers bring iron weapons and military organization that will eventually pose Israel's greatest external threat. Yet, even in their early expansion phase, when their strength seems overwhelming, God demonstrates that no enemy is too advanced, too numerous, or too well equipped to resist his purposes. The ox goad becomes a symbol of how God works through ordinary people with ordinary tools to accomplish extraordinary things. Shamgar probably tends cattle when the crisis strikes. He faces trained warriors with their bronze-tipped spears and leather armor, using nothing but a farmer's implement. Yet, the Spirit of the Lord transforms both the man and his weapon into instruments of deliverance. After Ehud's death, Israel drifts back into familiar patterns of apostasy and oppression. This time, the oppressor comes from the north, where Jabin, king of Hazor, commands a sophisticated military machine built around iron chariots. His general Sisera operates from Harosheth of the Gentiles, with 900 iron chariots, a mobile fortress that can crush infantry formations and dominate open battlefields. For 20 years, this iron fist pounds Israel into submission. The northern tribes bear the brunt of the oppression. Their territories crisscrossed by Canaanite patrols and their villages subjected to tribute collection at sword point. Travel becomes dangerous. Trade routes close and normal life grinds to a halt under the weight of foreign domination. During these dark years, a woman named Deborah rises to prominence as both prophetess and judge. She holds court under a palm tree in the hill country of Ephraim, dispensing wisdom and settling disputes for people who travel from across Israel to seek her counsel. Her authority comes not from political appointment or military conquest, but from her reputation for hearing God's voice and speaking his truth. In a culture where women rarely hold public authority, Deborah's leadership role signals the depth of Israel's crisis. When men fail to provide spiritual direction, God raises up a woman to fill the void. Her emergence as judge doesn't challenge biblical patterns of leadership so much as highlight how far Israel has fallen from divine order. Deborah receives a word from the Lord concerning Israel's deliverance. She summons Barak, son of Abinoam, from the northern tribe of Naphtali, and delivers God's battle plan. 10,000 warriors from Naphtali and Zebulun are to deploy on Mount Tabor. From that elevated position, they will descend to face Sisera's chariots in the valley below, a seemingly suicidal strategy that can only succeed through divine intervention. Barak accepts the mission, but requests that Deborah accompany the army into battle. His condition reveals both wisdom and weakness. Wisdom in recognizing that victory depends on God's presence through his prophetess. Weakness in lacking the courage to lead without visible divine support. Deborah agrees to come, but prophesies that the glory of victory will go to a woman rather than to him. The deployment on Mount Tabor proceeds according to divine instruction. 10,000 men from 2 tribes gather on the mountain slopes, facing an enemy force equipped with the ancient world's most advanced military technology. Iron chariots represent centuries of metallurgical development, tactical innovation, and battlefield experience. Against such weapons, infantry seems hopelessly outmatched. Yet God controls more than military hardware. At the appointed time, he sends a torrential rainstorm that turns the valley floor into a muddy quagmire. The mighty iron chariots become anchors rather than weapons, their bronze-shod wheels sinking deep into the softened earth. Sisera's mobile advantage transforms into a fatal disadvantage. Barak leads the charge down Mount Tabor at precisely the moment when divine intervention has leveled the battlefield. The Israelite infantry crashes into Sisera's immobilized forces like a wave against a sand castle. Panic spreads through Canaanite ranks faster than the attacking warriors. The army that had oppressed Israel for 2 decades dissolves in confusion and terror. Sisera abandons his trapped chariot and flees on foot toward what he believes is sanctuary. He seeks refuge in the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. The Kenites maintain neutrality in regional conflicts, and Heber has established peaceful relations with King Jabin. Sisera expects hospitality and protection according to ancient customs governing guest rights. Jael receives the fugitive general with apparent warmth, offering milk to quench his thirst and a place to rest in her tent. She covers him with a blanket and stands guard while he sleeps, creating an illusion of safety that allows exhaustion to overcome his natural caution. Yet her hospitality masks deadly intent. While Sisera sleeps, Jael takes a tent peg and hammer, tools of her nomadic lifestyle, and drives the peg through his temple into the ground beneath. The irony strikes deep. The general who had terrorized Israel with iron weapons dies by implements of domestic life wielded by a woman's hand. God's promise through Deborah finds fulfillment in the most unexpected way possible. When Barak arrives in pursuit of the fleeing general, Jael meets him at her tent door and shows him Sisera's body. The man who had refused to fight without a prophetess's presence discovers that even the final victory belongs to a woman. Divine glory flows through feminine channels, highlighting God's ability to work through anyone who will serve his purposes. The complete victory over Sisera's forces triggers a celebration that finds expression in one of the Bible's most ancient poems, the Song of Deborah and Barak. This victory hymn captures both the joy of deliverance and the horror of warfare, blending thanksgiving with graphic descriptions of battle's aftermath. The song praises the tribes that answered the call to war, while shaming those who remained safely at home. It celebrates divine intervention while acknowledging human courage. Most memorably, it describes Sisera's mother waiting at her window for her son's return, imagining that his delay results from dividing spoil rather than meeting death at a tent peg's point. 40 years of peace follow this great victory. Another generation granted the chance to walk in faithfulness or drift toward apostasy. The pattern established through Othniel and Ehud continues through Deborah and Barak. God delivers his people when they cry out in genuine repentance, grants them rest as a reward for faithfulness, then watches as prosperity breeds spiritual complacency. Gideon, the reluctant hero. 7 years of Midianite oppression crush Israel's spirit more effectively than previous conquerors had managed through direct military occupation. The desert nomads don't establish permanent garrisons or administrative systems. Instead, they sweep across Israel's agricultural regions at harvest time like human locusts, consuming crops and livestock, leaving behind only devastation and despair. These annual invasions follow a pattern as predictable as the changing seasons. Every spring, Israel plants and tends their fields, hoping this year might be different. Every summer, they watch their crops grow and ripen, daring to dream of prosperity. Every autumn, they watch helplessly as Midianite raiders harvest what others have sown, driving off cattle and sheep, burning what they cannot carry away. The psychological warfare proves more effective than military campaigns. Israelites abandon their cities and villages to hide in mountain caves and forest strongholds. They live like fugitives in their own land, emerging only to scavenge what the raiders have missed. Normal life becomes impossible when any day might bring another wave of destruction. Among those reduced to hiding lives, Gideon, son of Joash, from the clan of Abiezer in the tribe of Manasseh, The angel of the Lord finds him threshing wheat in a winepress, a perfect symbol of Israel's reduced circumstances. Wheat should be threshed on hilltops where wind can separate grain from chaff. Instead, Gideon works in a hidden valley, using inefficient methods to avoid detection by Midianite scouts. The angel's greeting sounds almost mocking in context. "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." Gideon sees no evidence of divine presence and feels anything but valorous. His response reveals the theological crisis that accompanies military defeat. If God is truly with Israel, why has he allowed such suffering? Where are the miracles their fathers experienced in the wilderness and conquest periods? Gideon's questions echo through every generation that experiences divine silence. If the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles that our fathers told us about, saying, "Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?" But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of Midian. The angel's response cuts through Gideon's despair with a commission that seems to ignore his objections. "Go in this your might, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" The conversation reveals a pattern that will characterize Gideon's entire career. Divine confidence contrasted with human hesitation, heavenly purpose wrestling with earthly doubt. Gideon's objections flow from genuine humility rather than false modesty. His clan ranks among the weakest in Manasseh, and he holds the lowest position in his family. By every human measure, he seems spectacularly unqualified to lead Israel against their oppressors. Yet, God's choices rarely follow human logic or social conventions. The angel provides proof of his divine identity by accepting Gideon's offering and consuming it with fire from a rock. This miraculous sign convinces Gideon of the encounter's authenticity but increases his terror. He has seen God face to face and expects to die, according to ancient belief about divine encounters. The Lord's reassurance, "Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die," becomes Gideon's first taste of divine grace. That same night, God commands Gideon to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. The idol worship that brings Midianite oppression must be removed before deliverance can come. Gideon obeys, but does the work under cover of darkness, fearing his family's reaction more than God's command. Morning light reveals the destruction, and the townspeople demand Gideon's execution for religious vandalism. Yet his father, Joash, defends him with surprising logic. "Will you plead for Baal? Will you save him? He who will plead for him shall be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down." This defense earns Gideon the nickname Jerubbaal, "Let Baal contend," and establishes an important principle. Divine authority transcends human religious traditions. If Baal truly possesses power, he should defend his own interests. The idol's silence in the face of destruction speaks louder than any theological argument. The Midianites gather for their annual harvest raid, crossing the Jordan with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern tribes. Their combined force spreads across the valley of Jezreel like a dark cloud, ready to consume another year's worth of Israelite labor. Yet, this time will be different. God has prepared his instrument of deliverance. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon, transforming the hesitant farmer into a charismatic military leader. He sounds the trumpet call throughout Manasseh, and his own tribe responds with surprising unity. Messengers carry the call to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and warriors stream toward the gathering point like tributaries feeding a great river. Yet, even with divine empowerment, Gideon seeks additional confirmation of God's will. The famous fleece tests reveal both his lingering doubt and God's patient grace. First, he asks for dew on the fleece while the ground remains dry. When morning comes, he wrings a bowl of water from the fleece while the surrounding earth shows no moisture. Still uncertain, Gideon reverses the test, requesting that the fleece remain dry while dew covers the ground. Again, God accommodates his servant's weakness, providing the miraculous sign that confirms divine calling. The fleece tests become symbols of how God works with human frailty, providing reassurance without condemning doubt. 32,000 men gather at the spring of Harod, ready to follow Gideon against the Midianite multitude. The army looks impressive by Israelite standards, yet it remains vastly outnumbered by the enemy host camping across the valley. Human logic suggests that every available warrior will be needed for the coming battle. God's logic operates differently. He commands Gideon to reduce his army, explaining that Israel might claim credit for victory if they win with superior numbers. Anyone who feels afraid should be allowed to return home, a reasonable offer that immediately eliminates 2/3 of the volunteers. 22,000 men accept the invitation to leave, walking away from what appears to be certain death. The remaining 10,000 still seem too many to suit divine purposes. God institutes a second test, observing how the warriors drink from the spring. Those who lap water like dogs, remaining alert for danger, are separated from those who kneel and drink deeply, relaxing their guard. Only 300 men pass this final screening. The army's reduction from 32,000 to 300 seems to guarantee defeat by any military calculation. Yet God's strength shows most clearly through human weakness. The Midianite multitude will know that their defeat comes from heaven rather than human strategy when such a tiny force overwhelms their seemingly invincible host. Torches, trumpets, and Gideon's strange war. 300 men stand against an army described as being like locusts for multitude. The Midianites and their allies spread across the valley floor in numbers that defy counting. Their camels alone described as innumerable as sand on the seashore. By every military principle known to ancient warfare, Gideon's force should melt away at first contact with such overwhelming opposition. Yet God rarely fights according to human principles. He sends Gideon and his servant Purah on a nighttime reconnaissance mission to the edge of the Midianite camp. There they overhear a conversation that reveals divine strategy at work, even in enemy dreams. One Midianite soldier describes a troubling vision to his companion. "I had a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the host of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it so that it fell and overturned it so that the tent collapsed." His friend's interpretation chills both speakers. This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand, God has delivered Midian and all the camp. The symbolism strikes like lightning in the darkness. Barley bread represents the poorest food eaten by those who cannot afford wheat. Israel, reduced to hiding and scavenging, has become like coarse barley bread compared to the rich fare of their oppressors. Yet, in the dream, this humble substance topples the mighty tent that represents Midianite power. Gideon's confidence soars when he hears this divine confirmation. He returns to his 300 warriors with a battle plan that seems designed more to create confusion than inflict casualties. Each man receives a trumpet, a torch, and an empty jar to conceal the flame. They will surround the enemy camp at midnight, and at Gideon's signal break their jars, reveal their torches, and blow their trumpets simultaneously. The plan works through psychological warfare rather than direct assault. At midnight, when human alertness reaches its lowest ebb, 300 trumpets shatter the desert's silence. 300 torches blaze to life around the perimeter of the vast camp. 300 voices shout in unison, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." Panic spreads through Midianite ranks faster than fire through dry grass. Roused from sleep by unexpected noise and light, the confused raiders assume they face a massive assault. In the darkness, they cannot distinguish friend from foe. They begin striking at shadows and at each other, creating the very chaos they fear. The enemy army dissolves into a mob of terrified fugitives, fleeing in all directions. Those who survive the fratricidal carnage scatter toward the Jordan River, desperate to reach the safety of their own territory. What began as an orderly harvest raid becomes a rout that leaves the valley floor littered with bodies and abandoned equipment. Gideon sends messengers throughout Israel, calling up additional forces to pursue the fleeing enemy. The men of Ephraim capture the Jordan River crossings, cutting off the main escape route. They also capture and execute 2 Midianite princes, Oreb and Zeb, at locations that become known by their names, the Rock of Oreb and the Winepress of Zeb. Yet, success breeds new problems. The Ephraimites take offense that Gideon didn't call them for the initial battle, though they eagerly join the pursuit once victory seems assured. Their complaint reveals the tribal jealousies that constantly threaten Israel's unity. Why should Manasseh receive the glory while Ephraim provides only cleanup duty? Gideon's response demonstrates the diplomatic wisdom that will characterize his leadership. Rather than defending his actions or asserting his authority, he praises Ephraim's contribution. "What have I done now in comparison with you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer?" His humble answer turns away wrath and maintains tribal unity in the moment of victory. The pursuit continues eastward beyond the Jordan, where Gideon and his 300 original warriors track the surviving Midianite kings, Zebah and Zalmunna. Exhausted from the night battle and the long chase, they request food from the cities of Sukkoth and Penuel. Both towns refuse, questioning whether Gideon can actually complete his mission. "Are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in your hand, that we should give bread to your army?" The city's skepticism reveals how thoroughly Midianite oppression has crushed Israel's spirit. Even after witnessing God's miraculous deliverance, some still doubt that victory can be complete. Gideon promises to return and punish both cities after finishing his pursuit of the Midianite kings. The threat proves prophetic. Israel's deliverer will remember those who withheld support in the crucial hour. At Karkor, Gideon's weary band surprises the remnant of the Midianite host. Zebah and Zalmunna have gathered about 15,000 survivors from an army that once numbered like locusts. Even this fragment represents a substantial force. Yet, it crumbles before 300 men empowered by divine purpose. The 2 kings fall into Gideon's hands, bringing to completion the victory that began with breaking jars and flashing torches. Under interrogation, they admit to killing Gideon's brothers at Tabor during earlier raids. This personal element transforms military campaign into blood vengeance, adding private justice to public deliverance. Gideon offers his firstborn son Jether the honor of executing the captured kings. Yet, the boy proves too young and frightened for such a grim task. The kings themselves mock the situation. "Rise yourself and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength." They prefer death at the hands of a proven warrior rather than a trembling child. Gideon grants their request, striking them down and taking the golden crescents that adorned their camels' necks. These ornaments, symbols of desert nomad wealth and power, become trophies of Israel's complete triumph over their oppressors. On the return journey, Gideon fulfills his promises to the cities that had denied him support. At Sukkoth, he captures a young man who writes down the names of the town's leaders, 77 officials who had refused aid to Israel's army. Gideon disciplines them with thorns and briars from the wilderness, a painful reminder that neutrality in God's battles counts as opposition. Penuel receives harsher treatment. Gideon tears down the city's tower, the stronghold in which its leaders had trusted rather than in Israel's God. He also kills the men who had spoken proudly against the Lord's anointed. The twin punishments serve notice that Israel's deliverer will not tolerate contempt for divine authority. The complete victory over Midian triggers an unexpected response from the grateful nation. Representatives from across Israel approach Gideon with an unprecedented offer. "Rule over us, you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." The request marks a crucial turning point in Israel's political development. For the first time, the people explicitly seek to establish hereditary monarchy. They want to replace the chaotic cycle of judges with stable dynastic rule. Their offer seems reasonable. Gideon has proven his leadership abilities and his faithfulness to God, yet Gideon rejects the crown with words that seem to maintain Israel's theocratic ideal. "I will not rule over you, and my son will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." His response appears to preserve the unique relationship between God and his chosen people, avoiding the trap of human kingship that had corrupted other nations. However, Gideon's rejection of formal monarchy doesn't prevent him from acting increasingly like a king. He makes a troubling request that reveals the corruption already working in his heart. "Let me make a request of you, that each of you give me the earrings from his spoil." The golden jewelry taken from Midianite casualties seems like modest compensation for his leadership. The people eagerly comply with this request, spreading a garment and filling it with golden earrings, crescents, pendants, and purple robes taken from the enemy. The total weight reaches 1,700 shekels of gold, an enormous fortune that transforms Gideon from a simple farmer into one of the wealthiest men in Israel. With this gold, Gideon creates an ephod, a priestly garment associated with seeking divine guidance. Yet, he doesn't give it to the legitimate priesthood serving at the tabernacle. Instead, he establishes his own religious center in his hometown of Ophrah, setting up what amounts to a rival shrine to the authorized worship system. The consequences unfold gradually but inevitably. All Israel played the harlot with it there, so that it became a snare to Gideon and his house. The very man who had torn down his father's altar to Baal becomes the source of new idolatry in Israel. The golden ephod, intended perhaps to honor God, becomes an object of worship that leads people away from true devotion. 40 years of peace follow Gideon's victory, but they carry the seeds of future chaos. The judge who refused to be king lives like royalty, taking many wives and fathering 70 sons. His household resembles a royal court, more than a simple family. Most significantly, he fathers a son named Abimelech through a concubine in Shechem, a relationship that will prove fateful for Israel's future. When Gideon finally dies, the nation's response reveals how shallow their spiritual reformation had been. As soon as Gideon died, the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal Berith their god. The people who had witnessed God's miraculous deliverance through breaking jars and blazing torches quickly returned to the very gods that had brought Midianite oppression. Worse still, they show no gratitude to Gideon's family for his years of faithful service. They did not show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. This ingratitude sets the stage for the bloody civil war that will follow Gideon's death as his neglected son seeks by force what the people refuse to give freely. Abimelech, the thorn bush king. The death of Gideon creates a power vacuum that his 70 sons seem unable or unwilling to fill. Unlike previous judges who arose through divine calling and charismatic leadership, Gideon's descendants inherit only wealth and social position. They lack their father's spiritual authority and his connection to Israel's desperate need for deliverance. In this leadership void, ambition grows like a weed seeking sunlight. Abimelech, son of Gideon, through a Shechemite concubine, possesses neither the legitimate inheritance of his brothers nor their security in established position. His mixed heritage, Israelite father, Canaanite mother, leaves him straddling two worlds without fully belonging to either. Yet this marginal status fuels, rather than dampens, his political aspirations. He approaches his mother's family in Shechem with a proposal wrapped in the language of practical politics. Which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? The question assumes what Gideon had explicitly rejected, that hereditary rule should replace the theocratic system God had established for Israel. Abimelech's argument appeals to Canaanite political traditions rather than Israelite religious principles. The city-state of Shechem had always been ruled by kings, and its population included many who had never fully accepted Israel's unique governmental system. They prefer familiar autocracy to the uncertain leadership of 70 brothers who might compete with each other for influence. The Shechemites embrace Abimelech's cause and provide him with 70 pieces of silver from the treasury of Baal Berith, their patron deity. The irony cuts deep. Money taken from an idol's temple funds the killing of men whose father had once torn down Baal's altar. The gold that Gideon had used to create a religious snare now enables his illegitimate son to destroy his legitimate offspring. With this blood money, Abimelech hires worthless and reckless men who follow him to his father's house in Ophrah. There, on a single stone, they systematically execute 69 of his half-brothers, the most comprehensive fratricide recorded in biblical history. The methodical nature of the slaughter reveals not passionate anger, but calculated elimination of political rivals. Only Jotham, the youngest son of Gideon, escapes the massacre by hiding until the executioners depart. His survival serves divine purposes, providing a prophetic voice that will speak truth about the crimes committed in Israel. Sometimes God preserves witnesses not to prevent evil, but to testify against it when judgment comes. The Shechemites gather at the oak beside the pillar in their city to crown Abimelech as their king. The ceremony combines Canaanite political traditions with sacred symbolism, lending religious authority to what amounts to a military coup. They create Israel's first monarch, not through divine appointment or popular acclaim, but through violence and tribal manipulation. Jotham learns of his brother's killing and his half-brother's coronation while hiding in the mountains. Rather than flee to safety, he climbs Mount Gerizim, the traditional place of blessing, overlooking Shechem, and delivers one of Scripture's most pointed political parables. His fable describes trees seeking a king to rule over them. They approach first the olive tree, whose oil provides light and honor to both gods and men. The olive tree refuses, asking why it should give up its beneficial work to wave over the other trees. The fig tree similarly declines, preferring to produce sweet fruit rather than assume political leadership. The vine receives the same invitation and gives the same response. Why should it abandon its work of producing wine that cheers both God and men to rule over the forest? Each productive tree recognizes that leadership would require abandoning the very qualities that make it valuable to the community. Finally, the trees approach the thorn bush, which eagerly accepts their offer. However, it demands that they truly commit to its leadership. If in truth you anoint me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the thorn bush and devour the cedars of Lebanon. The parable's meaning pierces like an arrow to its target. The worthy candidates for leadership, represented by olive, fig, and vine, have too much integrity to seek power for its own sake. Only the thorn bush, which produces nothing beneficial and offers no real protection, eagerly grasps for authority. Worse, it threatens to destroy everything around it, if not given complete loyalty. Jotham applies his parable directly to current events. If you have acted in truth and sincerity in making Abimelech king, and if you have dealt well with Jerubbaal and his house, and have done to him as his deeds deserved. For my father fought for you, risked his life, and delivered you out of the hand of Midian. But you have risen up against my father's house this day, and have killed his sons on one stone, and made Abimelech the son of his female servant king over the citizens of Shechem, because he is your brother. If you then have acted in truth and sincerity with Jerubbaal and with his house this day, then rejoice in Abimelech, and let him also rejoice in you. The prophetic curse follows immediately, but if not, let fire come out from Abimelech and devour the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo. And let fire come out from the citizens of Shechem and from Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. Having delivered his message, Jotham flees to Beer, where he remains in hiding throughout his half-brother's reign. His survival and testimony preserve the prophetic word that will guide interpretation of coming events. When fire does consume both Abimelech and his supporters, observers will understand that divine justice rather than political accident has brought about their destruction. For 3 years, Abimelech's reign proceeds without major incident. He rules Shechem and the surrounding territory like other Canaanite city kings, collecting tribute, maintaining armed forces, and projecting power throughout the region. His success seems to justify the Shechemites' choice and vindicate his violent path to the throne. Yet beneath the surface stability, resentment grows like infection in an untreated wound. God sends an evil spirit between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem, breaking the alliance that had seemed so beneficial to both parties. The supernatural intervention doesn't create new grievances, but amplifies existing tensions until they explode into open conflict. The Shechemites begin to see their king as he truly is, not a protector, but an oppressor, not their champion, but their exploiter. They had imagined that placing one of their own on the throne would advance their interests. But Abimelech serves only himself. They discover too late that thorn bushes offer neither shade nor protection, only thorns that wound those who come too close. Rebellion begins with guerrilla warfare. The Shechemites station ambush parties on the mountain passes, robbing travelers and disrupting trade. These attacks serve multiple purposes. They weaken Abimelech economically while building up resources for open revolt. They also send a message that the king no longer controls his own territory effectively. A man named Gaal, son of Ebed, arrives in Shechem with his brothers and quickly becomes a rallying point for anti-Abimelech sentiment. During a festival celebrating the grape harvest, when wine flows freely and inhibitions weaken, Gaal delivers a speech that crystallizes the rebels' grievances. Who is Abimelech, and who is Shechem that we should serve him? Is he not the son of Jerubbaal, and is not Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. But why should we serve him? Gaal's rhetoric plays on local pride and ethnic tension, arguing that Shechem should be ruled by true Shechemites rather than this half-breed upstart. Zebul, Abimelech's governor in the city, reports this seditious speech to his master, who immediately begins planning military response. The king's reaction reveals his true nature. He solves political problems through violence rather than negotiation or reform. Having gained power through bloodshed, he knows no other way to maintain it. The civil war that follows fulfills Jotham's prophetic curse with devastating precision. Fire consumes both the thorn bush king and those who sheltered beneath his branches, proving that violence begets violence, and that illegitimate authority contains the seeds of its own destruction. Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, the aristocrats of the highlands. After Jephthah's death, Israel entered a season of apparent calm. 3 judges emerged, each carrying the weight of leadership during these quieter years. Yet beneath their peaceful reigns lay the seeds of something troubling. Ibzan of Bethlehem rose first. Beyond his role as judge, he displayed wealth and influence that previous leaders had not shown. 30 sons and 30 daughters filled his household. More than simply having many children, he arranged marriages for all 60 of them outside his own clan. Each wedding represented a political alliance. Each ceremony strengthened his family's reach across tribal boundaries. This pattern revealed something new in Israel's leadership. Where earlier judges had focused on military deliverance, Ibzan built networks of power through family connections. His 7-year reign brought stability, but it also introduced the concept of dynastic rule. The judge's house had become a center of aristocratic influence. Elon, the Zebulonite, followed after Ibzan's death. His tenure in leadership left fewer details in the historical record. Zebulun's territory stretched across fertile valleys in the northern highlands. Elon's name meant oak tree, suggesting strength and deep roots in his homeland. During his decade as judge, the tribes experienced continued peace. Yet, even this quiet leader participated in the growing trend toward elite rule. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing social stratification in Israelite settlements. The gap between wealthy households and common families widened. Elon's long tenure allowed these changes to solidify across his territory. After Elon died, Abdon, son of Hillel, took leadership. His family tree revealed the new reality of judicial power. 40 sons and 30 grandsons surrounded him, creating a clan of 70 male descendants. These 70 young men rode donkeys, displaying their elevated status throughout the land. In ancient Israel, riding donkeys marked aristocratic privilege rather than common transportation. Abdon's 8-year reign represented the pinnacle of this aristocratic phase. His extensive family network controlled significant portions of Ephraim's hill country. The judge had evolved from emergency military leader into hereditary nobleman. His sons and grandsons formed a governing class that expected continued influence after his death. The transformation troubled many faithful Israelites. God's original design called for judges who would deliver their people, then return to ordinary life. Moses had warned against the temptation to establish royal dynasties. Samuel would later describe the burdens that kings place on their subjects. Yet here, in the supposedly temporary role of judge, dynastic ambitions took root. These three leaders, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon, governed during 45 combined years of peace. Their reigns brought economic prosperity and political stability. Trade routes reopened across tribal territories. Agricultural production increased in the highland valleys. Population centers grew as families felt secure enough to settle in permanent communities. But spiritual health declined even as material conditions improved. The elaborate family structures of these aristocratic judges required resources. Wealth concentration accelerated. Common farmers found themselves working land owned by judicial dynasties. The egalitarian vision of Israelite society, where each family possessed its own inheritance, began to fade. Archaeological discoveries from sites like Shiloh and Bethel show this period's material culture. Luxury items appeared in elite households, while simpler pottery dominated common homes. Fine jewelry, imported goods, and elaborate bronze work marked the possessions of ruling families. The contrast with earlier periods when material equality characterized Israelite settlements became stark. More troubling still, these peaceful judges failed to address the nation's underlying spiritual drift. No major religious reforms marked their reigns. No calls to covenant renewal echo in their stories. The central sanctuary at Shiloh continued its functions, but local shrines and foreign practices spread unchecked across the countryside. The priesthood itself reflected these changes. Levitical families originally scattered among the tribes to teach God's law, increasingly concentrated around wealthy patrons. Some priests accepted employment in private household shrines. Others served local sanctuaries that blended Israelite worship with Canaanite rituals. The clear distinction between acceptable and forbidden religious practices blurred. Foreign marriage alliances exemplified by Ibzan's 60 cross-clan weddings brought new cultural influences into Israelite families. While not explicitly forbidden, these connections introduced foreign religious ideas and social customs. The gradual assimilation of Canaanite practices accelerated through such marriages. Iron Age technology spreading throughout the region during this period created new possibilities for both agriculture and warfare. Israelite settlements adopted iron plows and tools, increasing agricultural productivity. But the same technology that improved farming also equipped potential enemies with superior weapons. The Philistines, masters of ironwork, gained significant military advantages during these decades. The peaceful reigns of these aristocratic judges masked gathering storms. Regional powers grew stronger, while Israel grew more comfortable. Egypt's influence waned, but new threats emerged from other directions. The Philistines consolidated control over coastal territories and pushed inland. Mesopotamian kingdoms stirred with renewed ambitions. Within Israel, tribal identities weakened as aristocratic networks crossed traditional boundaries. The judges' marriage alliances created loyalties that competed with tribal affiliations. When crisis would eventually come, these divided loyalties would complicate the nation's response. As Abdon's 8-year reign ended, Israel faced a moment of transition. The aristocratic model of leadership had run its course. The next enemy would be unlike previous oppressors. The Philistines possessed superior technology, organized military structures, and strategic coastal positions. They would test Israel's resolve in ways that required more than aristocratic politics to overcome. The stage was set for a different kind of judge, someone whose strength would be legendary, whose weaknesses would be equally remarkable. The peaceful decades under Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon had allowed Israel to grow comfortable with compromise. The coming years would demand a return to the miraculous interventions that marked earlier deliverances. These three aristocratic judges had governed well by human standards. Peace, prosperity, and political stability marked their combined reigns. Yet, they failed to strengthen Israel's covenant relationship with God. They built impressive family dynasties, but did not build spiritual foundations that could withstand future trials. Their legacy would be measured not in the comfort they provided, but in how well they prepared their nation for the challenges ahead. Samson is born, a Nazirite from the womb. In the hill country of Dan, where olive groves caught the morning light, lived a man named Manoah and his wife. Their marriage carried the quiet sorrow that childless couples knew well. Years had passed since their wedding day. Hope for children had slowly given way to resigned acceptance. The woman remained barren, unable to conceive despite their prayers and longing. During this time, the Philistines had begun their systematic oppression of Israel. Unlike previous enemies who raided and retreated, the Philistines came to stay. They established garrisons in strategic locations. Their iron weapons gave them military superiority over Israelite forces, still using bronze and stone tools. Slowly, methodically, they extended control over territories that had belonged to Israel for generations. The tribe of Dan felt this pressure most severely. Their original inheritance lay in the coastal plain, directly in the path of Philistine expansion. Many Danites had already migrated north, seeking land away from conflict. Those who remained lived under increasing restrictions and tribute demands. The situation seemed hopeless. On an ordinary day, as Manoah's wife worked alone in their courtyard, a stranger appeared. His appearance was unlike any man she had seen. Light seemed to emanate from his presence. His clothing bore no marks of travel, though he claimed to come from afar. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that made her spirit tremble. "Though you are barren and childless," the visitor said, "you will conceive and give birth to a son." The words hung in the air like promises written in starlight. After years of disappointment, could such hope be real? But the angel continued with specific instructions that revealed the child's special calling. "No razor may touch his head, for the boy will be a Nazirite, set apart to God from the womb. He will begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines." The woman had heard of Nazirite vows before. Some people took temporary vows of consecration, abstaining from wine, avoiding contact with dead bodies, and leaving their hair uncut. These vows usually lasted for specific periods, marking seasons of special devotion to God. But this child would be a Nazirite from birth until death, set apart for a lifetime of service. More instructions followed. The woman herself must prepare for this special pregnancy. She must drink no wine or fermented drink. No unclean food should pass her lips. Her body would become the vessel through which God would prepare his chosen deliverer. When the angel departed, the woman's mind raced with questions and wonder. The encounter felt too extraordinary to believe, yet too vivid to dismiss. She ran to find Manoah, her words tumbling over each other as she described the visitor and his message. Manoah listened with growing amazement, but also with concern. His wife's description of the visitor suggested someone far beyond ordinary human messengers. The implications frightened him. If God was truly intervening in their lives in such a dramatic way, they needed to understand their responsibilities clearly. That evening, Manoah prayed earnestly. "Lord, please let the man of God you sent come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." His petition revealed the heart of a father who wanted to raise his promised son according to God's will. God heard Manoah's prayer. The angel appeared again, this time while the woman sat alone in the field. She immediately recognized him and ran to bring her husband. When Manoah arrived, he found the same extraordinary figure his wife had described. "Are you the one who talked to my wife?" Manoah asked, his voice tight with nervous respect. "I am," the angel replied. Manoah's questions poured forth. What kind of life should the child lead? What rules should govern his upbringing? How could they properly prepare for such a responsibility? The angel's answers reinforced the original instructions. The child must live according to Nazirite restrictions from birth. His calling would be unique among Israel's judges. Seeking to honor their visitor, Manoah offered hospitality. "We would like you to stay until we prepare a young goat for you." The offer reflected typical Middle Eastern courtesy, but the angel's response revealed his true nature. "Even if you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you prepare a burnt offering, offer it to the Lord." The distinction was crucial. Angels did not share meals with humans, but they could witness offerings made to God. Manoah still did not fully understand who stood before them. "What is your name?" he asked, "so that we may honor you when your word comes true." The angel's response carried mystery and warning. "Why do you ask my name? It is beyond understanding. Some names belong to realms too holy for human comprehension. Some identities transcend earthly categories." Despite his confusion, Manoah prepared the offering as instructed. He placed the young goat and grain offering on a rock, turning it into an altar. When he kindled the fire, something astonishing happened. As flames rose from the sacrifice, the angel ascended in the fire, disappearing into the smoke and light. Manoah and his wife fell face down in terror and worship. They had seen a messenger from God's presence. They had witnessed the divine realm break into their ordinary world. The reality of their situation finally struck them fully. "We are doomed to die," Manoah cried. "We have seen God." The fear reflected ancient understanding that sinful humans could not survive direct encounters with divine holiness. But his wife's wisdom provided comfort. If the Lord had meant to end our lives, he would not have accepted our burnt offering and grain offering from our hands. He would not have shown us all these things or told us what he did. Her logic revealed faith born from reflection on God's character. In the months that followed, the woman's body confirmed the angel's promise. She conceived and carried the child carefully, observing all the restrictions placed upon her. Her pregnancy became a living testimony to God's faithfulness and power. When the boy was born, they named him Samson, meaning little sun. Perhaps they saw brightness in his eyes that reminded them of the angel's radiant appearance. Perhaps they hoped he would bring light to Israel's darkening situation with the Philistines. As Samson grew, unusual signs marked his development. His physical strength exceeded that of other children. His hair grew thick and long, never cut according to his Nazirite vow. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir him even in childhood, preparing him for the extraordinary calling that awaited. Yet even in these early years, contradictions appeared in Samson's character. The boy, set apart for God, showed attraction to things that should have been foreign to him. His eyes wandered toward Philistine territories with curiosity rather than hostility. The very people he was called to deliver Israel from fascinated him. The stage was set for one of the most complex and troubling stories in Israel's history, a child born through miraculous intervention, dedicated to God from the womb, gifted with supernatural strength. Yet this same child would struggle with desires and choices that would lead him far from his consecrated calling. Manoah and his wife had received their long-awaited son. Israel had received a promised deliverer, but deliverance would come through a path neither they nor anyone else could have imagined. Lions, riddles, and burning foxes, Samson's revenge begins. Young Samson had grown into a man of remarkable physical power. His shoulders carried strength that seemed to flow from some divine source. His hands could bend iron, and his feet could outrun horses. Yet for all his supernatural gifts, his heart pulled him toward the very people Israel was supposed to resist. During his youth in the hill country between Dan and Judah, Samson often gazed westward toward Philistine territories. The coastal cities fascinated him with their advanced culture and sophisticated ways. Where Israelite settlements remained simple and agricultural, Philistine cities boasted impressive architecture, skilled craftsmanship, and refined social customs. One day, Samson traveled down to Timnah, a border town where Philistines and Israelites mingled for trade and commerce. There, his eyes fell upon a young Philistine woman whose beauty captured his attention completely. Her graceful movements and intelligent conversation stirred desires he had never experienced before. Returning home to his parents, Samson announced his intention with characteristic directness. "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Get her for me as my wife." Manoah and his wife were horrified. Their son, the promised deliverer of Israel, wanted to marry among the very people oppressing their nation. "Is there no acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people?" they pleaded. "Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But Samson's mind was set. "Get her for me," he insisted. "She's the right one for me." His words revealed a heart guided by personal desire rather than covenant faithfulness. The phrase, "right in my eyes," would echo throughout the final chapters of Judges, describing Israel's spiritual condition. What Samson's parents did not understand was that God could work even through their son's questionable choices. The Lord sought an occasion to confront the Philistines, and Samson's attraction to their culture would provide that opportunity. Divine providence can use even human weakness to accomplish larger purposes. Reluctantly, Manoah and his wife accompanied Samson to Timnah to arrange the marriage. As they traveled the rocky path through the vineyards, Samson walked ahead of his parents, his mind focused on the woman who had captured his heart. Suddenly, a young lion emerged from the undergrowth with a roar that shook the hillside. Its muscles rippled under golden fur as it prepared to attack. Most men would have fled in terror or called for help, but the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson in that moment. With his bare hands, Samson grabbed the lion and tore it apart as easily as someone might tear a young goat. The supernatural strength that had been stirring in him since childhood now manifested in full force. The lion's powerful jaws, capable of crushing bones, proved no match for the Nazarite's God-given power. Yet Samson told neither his father nor mother what he had done. Perhaps he sensed that his parents already worried about his choices. Perhaps the ease with which he had dispatched the predator troubled even him. The dead lion lay hidden in the brush as they continued toward Timnah. The marriage negotiations proceeded successfully. The young woman pleased Samson even more upon closer acquaintance. Her family welcomed the alliance, seeing opportunity in connection with this unusually strong Israelite. Plans were made for a wedding feast that would last 7 days, according to Philistine custom. Sometime later, when Samson returned to Timnah for the wedding ceremony, he turned aside to look at the lion's carcass. What he discovered there amazed him. A swarm of bees had built their hive inside the lion's remains. Rich honey filled the cavity where once fierce life had resided. Without hesitation, Samson scooped honey from the dead body and ate it as he walked. He also gave some to his parents, though he did not explain where he had obtained this sweet treat. The act violated his Nazirite vow, which forbade contact with dead bodies. But Samson seemed increasingly willing to bend the rules that governed his consecrated life. At the wedding feast, 30 Philistine companions joined Samson in celebration. These young men represented Timnah's elite families, invited to honor the unusual marriage between Israelite and Philistine. The feast created an atmosphere of goodwill and cultural exchange. But Samson, perhaps feeling the need to display his cleverness as well as his strength, proposed a contest that would test his companions' wisdom. "Let me tell you a riddle," he announced. "If you can give me the answer within the 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes." The wager was substantial. Fine linen and quality clothing represented significant wealth in ancient times. The Philistine men, confident in their education and wit, accepted the challenge eagerly. Samson's riddle drew from his secret encounter with the lion. Out of the eater, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. The words contained layers of meaning that only someone who had witnessed the honey-filled carcass could understand. For 3 days, the Philistine men pondered the riddle without success. They tried various interpretations, consulted learned men, and debated possible answers. Nothing fit the cryptic clues satisfactorily. As the deadline approached, their frustration turned to anger. On the 4th day, they confronted Samson's new wife with threats. "Coax your husband into explaining the riddle for us," they demanded. or we will burn you and your father's household to death. Did you invite us here to steal our property?" The woman found herself trapped between her husband's game and her people's threats. Tears streaming down her face, she pleaded with Samson, "You hate me. You don't really love me. You've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer." Samson initially resisted her appeals. "I haven't even explained it to my father or mother," he protested, "so why should I explain it to you?" But her tears and continued pleading wore down his resolve. On the seventh day, he finally revealed the riddle's solution. Immediately, the woman shared the answer with her countrymen. Just before sunset, on the seventh day, the men of the city came to Samson with their response. "What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?" Samson immediately understood what had happened. His wife had betrayed his confidence to save herself and her family from threats. Anger blazed in his eyes as he responded, "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." The Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson in power, but this time his strength served vengeance rather than justice. He went down to Ashkelon, one of the major Philistine cities, and struck down 30 men. Taking their garments, he returned to pay the wager he had lost through betrayal. But Samson's anger burned too hot for such simple resolution. Without a word to his new wife, he left Timnah and returned to his father's house. The marriage that had begun with celebration ended in abandonment and rage. The woman's father, assuming Samson had permanently rejected his daughter, gave her in marriage to one of the 30 companions who had attended the wedding feast. The practical decision made sense by Philistine customs, but it guaranteed further conflict with the volatile Israelite strongman. When Samson learned of his wife's remarriage, his fury knew no bounds. The personal betrayal merged with his supernatural calling in ways that would bring terror to Philistine territories. His revenge would be both creative and devastating. Samson caught 300 foxes, a feat that required extraordinary patience and skill. Tying them tail to tail in pairs, he fastened torches between their tails. When he lit the torches and released the panicked animals, they ran through Philistine fields, setting fire to grain, vineyards, and olive groves. The agricultural destruction was massive. Months of careful cultivation went up in flames. The economic loss crippled multiple Philistine communities. But more than material damage, Samson's fox attack demonstrated his ability to strike at will across their territory. When the Philistines discovered who had caused this catastrophe and why, they took their own revenge. They burned Samson's wife and her father, the very people their threats had originally sought to protect. The cycle of violence had begun in earnest. Samson's response to their retaliation revealed the depths of his rage. "Since you've acted like this," he declared, "I swear that I won't stop until I get my revenge on you." His personal vendetta now merged completely with his calling to begin Israel's deliverance from Philistine oppression. The promised deliverer had begun his work, but not in the way anyone had expected. Instead of righteous warfare guided by divine strategy, Samson's efforts emerged from wounded pride and personal betrayal. The path of deliverance would be as complex and troubled as the man called to walk it. Jawbone of a donkey, Samson's blood path. After the foxes burned Philistine fields, and the Philistines responded by killing Samson's wife and her father, the spiral of violence accelerated beyond anyone's control. Samson's fury had been kindled, and like a wildfire in dry grass, it spread rapidly across the borderlands between Israel and Philistia. True to his vow, Samson attacked the Philistines with devastating force. The biblical account describes his assault with vivid simplicity. He attacked them viciously and slaughtered many of them. His supernatural strength, combined with tactical cunning and unbridled rage, made him a one-man army against his enemies. The scale of destruction forced Samson to retreat to safer territory. He climbed up to a cave in the rock of Etam, a fortress-like outcropping in Judah's territory. From this elevated position, he could see for miles across the valleys below and spot approaching enemies long before they could threaten him. But Samson's private war had created problems for his fellow Israelites. The Philistines, unable to capture their tormentor, decided to apply pressure on the wider Israelite population. They marched their armies into Judah, setting up camp near the town of Lehi. Their message was clear: deliver Samson or face collective punishment. The men of Judah faced an impossible situation. They lived under Philistine domination and could not afford open confrontation with their overlords. Yet, Samson belonged to their people, and many secretly admired his bold defiance of their oppressors. The tension between survival and solidarity created heated debates in every Judahite settlement. Eventually, practical concerns won. 3,000 men from Judah climbed to Etam to confront their troublesome kinsman. The size of their delegation revealed both their respect for Samson's strength and their desperation to resolve the crisis peacefully. "Don't you realize that the Philistines are rulers over us?" they pleaded with Samson. "What have you done to us?" Their words revealed the depth of Israel's subjugation. After generations of gradual Philistine encroachment, many Israelites had accepted foreign domination as inevitable. Samson's response showed his perspective on the conflict. "I merely did to them what they did to me." From his viewpoint, the violence had been reactive rather than aggressive. The Philistines had betrayed and destroyed his marriage. He had simply responded in kind. The men of Judah proposed a solution that seemed reasonable to them. "We've come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines." They assured Samson they would not harm him themselves, only deliver him to his enemies as demanded. Surprisingly, Samson agreed to their plan. "Swear to me that you won't attack me yourselves," he requested. Perhaps he trusted his God-given strength to provide escape when the moment came. Perhaps he wanted to avoid violence against his own people. The Judahites readily gave their oath. Using new ropes, they bound Samson securely and began the journey down from Etam toward the Philistine camp at Lehi. The procession must have been both triumphant and somber for the men of Judah. They were solving their immediate crisis, but delivering their strongest warrior to certain death. As they approached the Philistine forces, shouts of joy erupted from the enemy ranks. Finally, the troublemaker, who had burned their crops and disrupted their territories, was in their hands. They rushed forward to claim their prize, eager to exact revenge for months of humiliation. But as the Philistines came near, something extraordinary happened. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon Samson, just as it had when he faced the lion years earlier. The new ropes that bound his arms became like flax that had caught fire. They fell from his hands as if they had never been secured. Free from his bonds, Samson looked around for a weapon. His eyes fell upon the fresh jawbone of a donkey, recently deceased. In the ancient world, such bones were considered unclean. But Samson grabbed it without hesitation. His Nazirite vows, already compromised by contact with the lion's carcass and honey, mattered less than immediate survival. What followed entered the realm of legend. Wielding the donkey's jawbone like a club, Samson waded into the Philistine forces. His supernatural strength made the crude weapon devastatingly effective. Skulls cracked under his blows. Bodies fell like wheat before a scythe. The Philistines, so confident moments before, found themselves facing destruction beyond their imagination. Their bronze swords and iron spearheads proved useless against an opponent whose strength came from divine sources. Panic spread through their ranks as their comrades fell around them. When the slaughter ended, 1,000 Philistine warriors lay dead around Samson. The improvised weapon in his hand had accomplished what organized Israelite armies had failed to achieve. The psychological impact on both sides would be enormous. In the aftermath of victory, Samson composed a victory song that played on Hebrew wordplay. "With a donkey's jawbone, I have made donkeys of them. With a donkey's jawbone, I have struck down 1,000 men." The Hebrew word for donkey, kamor, created poetic resonance with the word for heap, koma, celebrating both the weapon and the pile of bodies it had created. But superhuman effort, even when divinely empowered, takes its toll on mortal frames. Samson's strength had carried him through the battle, but now thirst threatened to finish what the Philistines could not. The exertion of single combat against 1,000 enemies had dehydrated him to the point of collapse. "You have given your servant this great victory," Samson prayed to God. "Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" His prayer revealed both gratitude for divine assistance and concern that rescue might be incomplete. God heard his prayer with compassion. In the place where Samson had won his victory, the Lord opened a hollow in the ground, and water flowed forth. The spring provided sweet life, giving water that restored Samson's strength and renewed his spirit. Samson named the place En-Hakkore, meaning spring of the one who called. The name commemorated both God's response to his prayer and the divine source of his victory. Throughout his subsequent career, that spring would remind him of God's faithfulness in desperate circumstances. The victory at Lehi established Samson's reputation throughout the region. Philistines would speak his name in whispers, remembering the day when their 1,000 warriors fell to a single man with an animal bone. Israelites would tell and retell the story, finding hope in their darkest hours of oppression. But the victory also established a troubling pattern in Samson's career. His greatest triumphs came through personal crisis rather than planned campaigns. He reacted to circumstances rather than leading strategic initiatives. His calling to begin the deliverance of Israel was being fulfilled, but in ways that depended entirely on his individual strength rather than national renewal. The donkey's jawbone victory marked a turning point in Philistine-Israelite relations. No longer could the Philistines assume easy dominance over their subjects. A new factor had entered their calculations, a man whose strength seemed to come from Israel's God and who could strike at will across their territory. Yet for all his military success, Samson remained a solitary figure. He had no army, no organized following, no systematic plan for liberation. His victories were spectacular, but isolated, dependent entirely on divine intervention in moments of crisis. The spring at En-Hakkore would continue flowing long after Samson's death, a reminder of the day when God's power flowed through human weakness to achieve impossible victory. But it would also remind future generations of the complex relationship between divine calling and human character, between supernatural gifting and personal faithfulness. Samson judged Israel for 20 years following his victory at Lehi. Those 2 decades would see more amazing demonstrations of strength, more complex entanglements with Philistine culture, and ultimately the most tragic conclusion in the entire book of Judges. Delilah, love, betrayal, and the fall of the strong man. Years passed after Samson's victory at Lehi, and his reputation as Israel's strong man grew with each retelling. The Philistines learned to avoid direct confrontation with him, but they never stopped seeking ways to neutralize the threat he represented. Their opportunity would come through the same weakness that had brought him trouble before, his attraction to Philistine women. During his 20 years as judge, Samson had continued his pattern of involvement with foreign women. His visit to a prostitute in Gaza had nearly ended in disaster when the Philistines tried to trap him there. Only his supernatural strength, demonstrated by carrying off the city gates, had saved him from their ambush. But Samson's most fateful encounter came when he met Delilah, a woman living in the valley of Sorek. Whether she was Philistine by birth or simply allied with their cause, the text does not specify. What matters is that she lived in territory controlled by Philistine interests and would serve their purposes completely. The valley of Sorek stretched between Israelite hill country and Philistine coastal plains, a borderland where both peoples mingled for trade and commerce. Its location made it perfect for the kind of relationship Samson preferred. Close enough to his homeland for safety, yet exotic enough to satisfy his fascination with Philistine culture. Delilah possessed beauty and intelligence that captivated Samson completely. Unlike his previous relationships, this one seemed to offer genuine companionship along with physical attraction. She listened to his stories with apparent fascination. She laughed at his jokes and seemed to appreciate his unique position in Israel's history. The rulers of the Philistines quickly recognized the opportunity Delilah presented. They approached her with an offer that revealed both their desperation and their wealth. Each of the 5 Philistine lords would give her 1,100 shekels of silver if she could discover the source of Samson's strength and find a way to subdue him. The sum was staggering. 5,500 shekels of silver represented more wealth than most people could imagine. For perspective, the average worker earned perhaps 10 shekels per year. Delilah was being offered enough money to live in luxury for the rest of her life. But beyond the financial incentive lay political pressure. Delilah lived in Philistine-controlled territory and depended on their protection. Refusing such a request from the 5 rulers would have been dangerous, possibly fatal. She found herself trapped between greed and survival. Delilah's approach was subtle and patient. Rather than immediately pressing for Samson's secrets, she built trust through genuine seeming affection. She created an atmosphere of intimacy where confidences might naturally be shared. Her strategy showed sophisticated understanding of male psychology. When she finally broached the subject, her words seemed playful rather than threatening. "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." She presented the question as a lover's game, a curiosity born of admiration rather than hostile intent. Samson, perhaps sensing danger but unwilling to resist her charms, gave false answers designed to mislead potential enemies while maintaining the appearance of trust. "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried," he said, "I'll become as weak as any other man." Delilah immediately tested his claim. The Philistine rulers provided 7 fresh bowstrings, and she bound Samson while he slept. Hidden men waited in her room, ready to capture him once his strength was neutralized. When she cried, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you," he snapped the bowstrings like threads and easily escaped. The pattern repeated twice more. Samson claimed he could be subdued by new ropes, then by weaving his hair into a loom. Each time, Delilah tested his words and found them false. Each time, hidden Philistines waited in vain to capture their enemy. But rather than abandoning her mission, Delilah intensified her emotional pressure. "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me?" she complained. "This is the 3rd time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." Day after day, she pressed him with such words. Her persistence wore down his defenses like water wearing away stone. The biblical text captures Samson's experience. She tormented him with her nagging until he was sick to death of it. Finally, Samson's resistance crumbled. In a moment of weakness that would define the rest of his life, he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he confessed, "because I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." Delilah recognized truth when she heard it. Something in Samson's voice, perhaps relief at finally sharing his deepest secret, convinced her that his words were genuine this time. She immediately sent word to the Philistine rulers, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." The 5 lords returned with the promised silver, their hearts racing with anticipation. After years of frustration and humiliation, they were finally about to neutralize Israel's strongest champion. They brought their money and their soldiers, preparing for the moment they had bought so dearly. That night, Delilah lulled Samson to sleep on her lap, perhaps singing softly or stroking his uncut hair. When she was certain he slept deeply, she signaled to a man hidden nearby. The barber crept forward with his razor and carefully, silently, began cutting away the 7 braids that had never known a blade. As the last strand fell, something invisible but profound departed from Samson's body. The supernatural strength that had been his constant companion since childhood vanished like morning mist. The Spirit of the Lord, grieved by years of compromise and finally by this complete breaking of the Nazirite vow, withdrew from the sleeping strong man. Delilah's voice pierced his dreams. "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He woke as he had 3 times before, expecting to break free and scatter his enemies. "I'll go out as before and shake myself free," he thought. But he did not realize that the Lord had left him. This time, when Philistine soldiers seized him, his struggles accomplished nothing. His arms, which had torn lions and wielded jawbones, could not break even ordinary ropes. His legs, which had carried city gates, could barely support his own weight. The terrible realization crashed over him. His strength was truly gone. The Philistines wasted no time in securing their prize. They gouged out Samson's eyes, ensuring he could never again see to target his enemies effectively. The man who had gazed lustfully at forbidden women would see no more beauty in this world. The darkness that descended was both physical and spiritual. Bronze shackles bound his feet, and they led him down to Gaza, the very city whose gates he had once carried away in triumph. There, they put him to work, grinding grain in the prison, a task usually reserved for animals or the lowest slaves. The wheel turned endlessly, and Samson walked its circle like a blind ox, his mighty frame reduced to mere labor. Yet in prison, subtle changes began. His hair, shorn so completely by Delilah's barber, started to grow again. The biblical narrator notes this detail without comment, but its significance would prove enormous. Physical renewal often precedes spiritual restoration. More importantly, the humiliation and suffering began working changes in Samson's heart. Stripped of his strength, separated from the temptations that had repeatedly led him astray, he had time to reflect on his life and choices. The grinding wheel became a place of meditation, its repetitive motion creating space for repentance. The Philistines, meanwhile, celebrated their victory with increasing confidence. They had captured and neutralized Israel's greatest champion. Their technical superiority in iron weapons, combined with organized military tactics, seemed to guarantee continued dominance over the scattered Israelite tribes. Plans were made for a great festival to honor Dagon, their chief deity. In their theology, Samson's capture proved Dagon's superiority over Israel's God. The festival would publicly demonstrate their triumph and discourage any remaining Israelite resistance. But they had forgotten a crucial aspect of Israel's covenant faith. The God who had given Samson his strength was also the God of forgiveness and restoration. Samson's hair was growing, but more significantly, his relationship with his Creator was being renewed through suffering and genuine repentance. The stage was being set for one final demonstration of divine power. Delilah had received her silver and disappeared from history. The Philistine lords believed their greatest threat was permanently neutralized. But in the darkness of Gaza's prison, strength was slowly returning to arms that had once made impossible things possible. The woman, whose name meant delicate, had accomplished what armies could not achieve. Yet her betrayal, devastating as it was, would not write the final chapter of Samson's story. The God who had called him from the womb still had purposes to fulfill through his flawed and fallen champion. Samson's last stand, the temple falls. Months passed in the grinding darkness of Gaza's prison. Samson's world had shrunk to the endless circle of the millstone, the rough touch of his chains, and the mocking voices of his captors. Yet in this place of humiliation, something profound was happening that his enemies could not see. The Philistine lords had planned a magnificent festival to honor their god Dagon for delivering Samson into their hands. The celebration would demonstrate their deity's superiority over Israel's God and provide public entertainment through their captive's humiliation. Thousands would gather to witness the spectacle. The Temple of Dagon in Gaza was an architectural marvel, one of the largest buildings in the ancient world. Massive stone pillars supported its roof, creating a vast interior space that could hold 3,000 people on the main floor alone. Additional galleries and roof areas accommodated even more spectators. As the festival day arrived, excitement filled the air throughout Gaza and the surrounding Philistine territories. People traveled from distant cities to participate in the celebration. The capture of Samson represented more than military victory. It symbolized the triumph of their civilization over the primitive hill people of Israel. Wine flowed freely as the festivities began. Philistine nobles recounted stories of Samson's past exploits, now safely in the past. They praised Dagon for delivering their enemy into their hands. The mood grew increasingly jubilant as speakers described their victory in ever more elaborate terms. "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands," they chanted. The crowd responded with cheers and renewed drinking. The festival atmosphere masked the cruel purpose at its heart, the public humiliation of a fallen enemy. When the crowd reached peak excitement, someone called for the main attraction, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." The shout was taken up by thousands of voices, creating a thunderous demand that echoed throughout the temple complex. Guards descended to the prison and roughly hauled Samson from his grinding wheel. They led him through the streets as crowds gathered to mock and jeer. Children threw stones and garbage, adults spat and cursed. The man who had once terrified their armies now provided amusement for their festivals. But those closest to Samson might have noticed changes in his appearance. His hair, completely shaved months ago, had grown significantly. His shoulders, though bowed by imprisonment, still carried impressive muscle. Most importantly, his face showed a peace that had been absent during his years of self-indulgent violence. In the temple, Samson was positioned between the two central pillars that supported the main structure. These massive columns, each several feet in diameter, bore the weight of the roof and upper galleries where additional spectators had gathered. The architect's design concentrated enormous structural stress on these critical support points. A young Philistine servant was assigned to guide Samson during the ceremony. The boy seemed almost sympathetic to the blind prisoner, perhaps uncomfortable with the crowd's cruelty. When Samson spoke to him quietly, he listened with attention rather than contempt. "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple," Samson requested, "so I may lean against them." The request seemed innocent enough, a blind, weakened man seeking physical support. The servant positioned him between the central columns without suspicion. The crowd's entertainment began with speeches recounting Samson's past deeds and praising Dagon for his defeat. They made him perform feats of strength with objects designed to prove his weakness. When he failed to break ropes that he had once snapped like thread, the audience roared with laughter and derision. As the mockery continued, Samson's hands explored the pillars behind him. His fingers traced their circumference, estimating their thickness and stability. His mind, sharpened by months of reflection, calculated angles and structural stress points with the expertise of a man who had spent his life in physical combat. But more importantly, Samson's heart turned toward the God he had served so imperfectly for so many years. In the depths of his humiliation, surrounded by enemies celebrating his downfall, he found the faith that had been obscured by years of self-will and compromise. "Sovereign Lord," he prayed silently, "remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." His prayer combined personal desire for justice with recognition of divine sovereignty. The prayer revealed both growth and limitation in Samson's spiritual condition. He acknowledged God's authority and sought divine intervention rather than relying solely on human strength. Yet his motivation remained partially personal, revenge for his blindness rather than pure concern for Israel's deliverance. Nevertheless, God heard his prayer with compassion. The same spirit who had empowered Samson's earlier victories began to stir within him once again. Strength flowed back into muscles that imprisonment had weakened. Power returned to arms that grinding grain had kept strong despite captivity. Positioning himself carefully between the pillars, Samson placed his hands against their smooth surfaces. The crowd continued their celebration, unaware that their entertainment was about to become their destruction. 3,000 people packed the main floor, with additional thousands crowding the galleries above. "Let me die with the Philistines," Samson whispered, his final prayer combining desperation with determination. He had nothing left to live for in human terms. His eyes were gone, his freedom lost, his reputation destroyed, but he could still serve his people's cause through one final act of strength. With all the power that divine grace could pour into mortal frame, Samson pushed against the central pillars. The massive columns, designed to support enormous weight when properly balanced, could not withstand the focused pressure applied at their weakest points. Stone cracked with sounds like thunder, the pillars shifted, then began to topple. The roof, suddenly unsupported, collapsed with a roar that could be heard throughout Gaza. Upper galleries fell into the main hall, crushing the crowds below under tons of stone and timber. In moments, the Temple of Dagon became a tomb for thousands of Philistines. Their celebration turned to screams, then to silence as the structure buried victims and survivors alike. The architectural marvel that had symbolized Philistine power became a monument to their vulnerability. Samson died in the collapse, crushed along with his enemies under the weight of falling stone. His final act achieved more than all his previous victories combined. The biblical narrator observes that the dead he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. The psychological impact on Philistine society was devastating. Their leaders gathered for the festival perished in the temple's collapse. Their confidence in Dagon's protection was shattered. Their sense of inevitable victory over Israel evaporated in the dust of fallen stones. News of the temple's destruction spread rapidly throughout both Philistine and Israelite territories. For the Philistines, it represented catastrophic loss of leadership and divine protection. For the Israelites, it provided hope that their God had not abandoned them despite years of oppression. Samson's brothers and his father's whole family came down to retrieve his body from the rubble. They carried him back to the hill country and buried him in the tomb of Manoah, his father, between Zorah and Eshtaol, where his story had begun. The man who had judged Israel for 20 years left a complex legacy. His supernatural strength had amazed friends and terrified enemies. His moral weaknesses had led to personal tragedy and national complications. Yet, in the end, his final act of faith achieved more for Israel's deliverance than decades of conventional warfare might have accomplished. Samson's story reveals both the possibilities and limitations of divine calling. God can work through flawed human instruments to accomplish his purposes. Yet, personal faithfulness enhances rather than replaces divine empowerment. The strongest man in Israel's history was also one of its most tragic figures, teaching future generations that gifts without character ultimately lead to destruction. Micah's idols, when religion becomes a business. In the hill country of Ephraim, far from the dramatic events surrounding Samson's final victory, lived a man named Micah, whose story would reveal the spiritual decay spreading throughout Israel like rot in timber. His tale begins with an act that seemed righteous, but contained seeds of religious confusion that would grow into full apostasy. Micah's mother had lost 1,100 shekels of silver, a substantial fortune that represented years of savings. In her distress, she pronounced a curse upon whoever had taken her treasure, calling down divine judgment on the unknown thief. Her words carried the weight of covenant authority, invoking God's justice against the crime. But Micah himself had stolen the silver. Living in his mother's household, he had taken the money for purposes the text does not specify. Perhaps he needed funds for some venture. Perhaps he simply wanted wealth that was not rightfully his. Whatever his motivation, the theft violated fundamental commandments about honoring parents and respecting property. When his mother's curse reached his ears, fear gripped Micah's heart. He understood the power of such pronouncements in Israel's covenant culture. Divine judgment might fall upon him at any moment. Terror overcame greed, and he confessed his crime to his mother. The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, and about which I heard you utter a curse, he said, I have that silver with me. I took it. His confession revealed both guilt and hope for forgiveness. His mother's response seemed to offer grace and restoration. The Lord bless you, my son, she exclaimed, apparently relieved to have her money returned and her son's confession. But her next words revealed spiritual confusion that would prove more dangerous than the original theft. I solemnly consecrate my silver to the Lord for my son to make an image and an idol, she declared. The statement contained a profound contradiction. She wanted to honor Israel's God, but through means he had explicitly forbidden. The law clearly prohibited making images or idols of any kind to represent the divine presence. From the 1,100 shekels, the woman gave 200 to a silversmith who crafted both a carved image and a cast idol. The remaining 900 shekels apparently stayed with Micah, whose name ironically meant, "Who is like God?" The man, whose name proclaimed divine uniqueness, was about to establish a private religious system that violated everything that uniqueness represented. Micah installed the idols in his house, creating what amounted to a private shrine. He also made an ephod, the sacred vestment associated with priestly service, and some household gods called teraphim. His religious innovation combined elements of Israelite worship with practices borrowed from surrounding cultures. The ephod represented a particularly troubling development. This garment, originally designed for Israel's high priest to use in determining God's will, was being crafted for private use by someone with no priestly calling. Micah was essentially creating his own religious authority structure. To complete his private religious system, Micah installed one of his sons as priest. The young man had no Levitical lineage, no training in proper worship procedures, and no divine calling to priestly service. But in Micah's confused theology, family authority could override God's specific instructions about religious leadership. This arrangement satisfied Micah completely. "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me," he declared, "since this Levite has become my priest." His words revealed the transactional thinking that had replaced covenant faithfulness. He believed proper religious forms, even when improperly established, would guarantee divine blessing. The system worked well enough for a time. Micah's household shrine provided religious satisfaction without the inconvenience of traveling to Shiloh for proper worship. His private priest offered counsel and performed ceremonies according to Micah's preferences rather than God's requirements. The arrangement seemed beneficial to all concerned. But genuine transformation came when a young Levite from Bethlehem in Judah came looking for a place to settle. Economic conditions had apparently driven him from his original location. He was traveling through Ephraim's hill country, seeking opportunities to support himself through his religious training and tribal identity. When the Levite arrived at Micah's house, the older man immediately recognized an opportunity to upgrade his private religious system. A genuine Levite, even one serving outside proper channels, would provide more credibility than his untrained son could offer. "Where are you from?" Micah asked the young man. "I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah," the visitor replied, "and I'm looking for a place to stay." Micah's response revealed his commercial approach to religion. "Live with me and be my father and priest," he offered, "and I'll give you 10 shekels of silver a year, your clothes and your food." The salary was modest but steady, providing security for a displaced religious professional. The arrangement suited both parties perfectly. The Levite gained employment that utilized his tribal identity and religious training. Micah gained a priest whose credentials would impress visitors and perhaps increase divine favor toward his household. The young Levite accepted the position and settled into Micah's household like a family member. He performed religious ceremonies, offered counsel on spiritual matters, and maintained the private shrine according to Micah's instructions. The relationship brought satisfaction to both men and apparent prosperity to the household. But the entire system violated fundamental principles of Israel's covenant faith. God had established specific procedures for worship, specific qualifications for priests, and a specific location for the central sanctuary. Micah's innovations, however sincere, represented rebellion against divine authority disguised as religious devotion. The story reveals how quickly spiritual compromise can spread when not confronted directly. Micah's theft led to his mother's misguided consecration. Her confused attempt at piety led to idol-making and private shrine establishment. The private shrine led to unauthorized priesthood. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they created a complete alternative to God's ordained worship system. More troubling still, the arrangement provided material benefits that seemed to validate its legitimacy. Micah prospered. His household remained secure. His private priests served faithfully. External circumstances suggested divine approval of their religious innovations. Yet the fundamental problem remained unchanged. Religious activity, however elaborate or sincere, cannot substitute for simple obedience to God's revealed will. The forms of worship mean nothing when separated from the substance of covenant faithfulness. Micah's story also illustrates how economic factors can corrupt religious practice. The young Levite's need for employment led him to serve in an unauthorized capacity. Micah's wealth enabled him to purchase religious services according to his preferences rather than God's requirements. Both men prioritized material security over spiritual integrity. The narrative sets the stage for even greater religious confusion in the chapters that follow. Micah's private shrine, established through mixed motives and maintained through commercial arrangements, would soon attract the attention of an entire tribe seeking divine guidance for their military adventures. But the underlying issue transcends the specific details of idol-making and unauthorized priesthood. The real problem was the absence of central authority that could maintain proper religious standards. Without strong leadership committed to covenant faithfulness, individual Israelites were free to create their own versions of acceptable worship. The phrase that concludes the book of Judges applies directly to Micah's situation. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Micah did what seemed right to him, combining genuine desire to honor God with methods that dishonored everything God represented. His story serves as a warning about the subtle ways religious corruption can disguise itself as spiritual devotion. Good intentions cannot sanctify forbidden practices. Sincere beliefs cannot override explicit divine commands. And material prosperity cannot validate spiritual rebellion, regardless of how convincing the external evidence might appear. The tribe of Dan: theft, idolatry, and a new city. The tribe of Dan faced a crisis that would test their faith and reveal the spiritual condition of Israel during the Judges era. Their original inheritance, assigned by Joshua years earlier, lay in the coastal plain between the Mediterranean Sea and the hill country. But this territory put them in direct conflict with the expanding Philistine confederation. Unlike other tribes who had fought to claim their promised lands, the Danites found themselves gradually squeezed out by enemies with superior iron weapons and organized military tactics. Philistine pressure made farming difficult and traveling dangerous. Many Danite families had already migrated northward, seeking safer territory away from the coast. The remaining Danites realized they needed a new homeland entirely. But rather than seeking God's guidance through proper religious channels, they decided to send scouts to find territory they could take by force. 5 warriors were chosen from their clans, men experienced in warfare and skilled in reconnaissance. These 5 men traveled northward through Israel's hill country, passing through various tribal territories as they searched for vulnerable targets. Their mission was essentially predatory, to find a people they could dispossess and a land they could claim without regard for justice or divine approval. As they journeyed through Ephraim's mountains, they came to Micah's house and recognized the voice of the young Levite serving as his private priest. Perhaps they had known him in Bethlehem before his current employment. Perhaps his accent or manner of speaking identified his origins. In any case, they turned aside to investigate. "Who brought you here?" they asked the Levite. "What are you doing in this place? Why are you here?" Their questions revealed both curiosity and opportunity. A displaced religious professional might prove useful for their expedition. The Levite explained his arrangement with Micah honestly. "He hired me, and I became his priest," he said, describing his employment situation without apparent shame or recognition of its impropriety. The Danite scouts immediately saw possibilities for obtaining divine guidance for their mission. "Please inquire of God to learn whether our journey will be successful," they requested. They wanted religious validation for their expedition, but they sought it through unauthorized channels rather than traveling to Shiloh, where legitimate priesthood could be consulted. The young Levite, flattered by their request and eager to demonstrate his religious authority, readily provided the guidance they sought. "Go in peace," he declared with confidence. "Your journey has the Lord's approval." His pronouncement gave the scouts exactly what they wanted to hear. Armed with this religious endorsement, the 5 men continued northward until they reached Laish, a prosperous city in the far north of Canaan. The settlement was inhabited by Sidonians who lived in security and prosperity, following the customs of their people. They dwelt in safety, with no powerful neighbors to threaten them. More importantly, from the scouts' perspective, Laish was isolated and vulnerable. They lived in safety, like the Sidonians, at peace and secure, the spies observed. The city had no defending ruler and was far from Sidon, too distant for help to arrive quickly in case of attack. The scouts also noted the region's fertility and resources. The land was good, capable of supporting a large population. Water was abundant, trade routes accessible, and natural defenses adequate. From a military standpoint, Laish represented an ideal target. Wealthy enough to be worth taking, weak enough to be conquered. Returning to their people in the area between Zorah and Eshtaol, the 5 scouts made their report with enthusiasm. "Come on, let's attack them," they urged their fellow Danites. "We have seen that the land is very good. Aren't you going to do something? Don't hesitate to go there and take it over." Their sales pitch emphasized both opportunity and divine approval. "When you get there, you will find an unsuspecting people and a spacious land that God has put into your hands," they declared, invoking their unauthorized religious consultation as validation for the proposed attack. The appeal succeeded completely. 600 Danite warriors armed themselves for conquest and set out with their families toward the northern territory. They traveled as a migrating tribe, bringing livestock, children, and household goods, along with their weapons and armor. On their way north, the expedition again passed through Ephraim and camped near Micah's house. The 5 original scouts shared intelligence about Micah's private shrine with their fellow warriors. The carved image, cast idol, ephod, and household gods represented portable religious authority that could benefit their new settlement. "Do you know that one of these houses has an ephod, some household gods, and an image overlaid with silver?" they asked their companions. "Now you know what to do." The implication was clear. They should steal these religious artifacts to establish worship in their new city. While the main force remained positioned strategically, the 5 scouts approached Micah's house with peaceful greetings. They found the young Levite at the entrance and engaged him in conversation, distracting him from their companions' activities inside the shrine. The other warriors quickly gathered Micah's religious artifacts, the carved image, the ephod, the household gods, and the cast idol. They worked efficiently, taking everything that might prove useful for their own religious system. The Levite, realizing what was happening, protested the theft. "What are you doing?" he demanded, attempting to prevent the removal of the religious objects he was supposed to guard. But the Danites had a better offer for him than mere employment in Micah's household. "Be quiet. Don't say a word. Come with us and be our father and priest," they proposed. "Isn't it better that you serve a tribe and clan in Israel as priest rather than just one man's household?" The appeal to ambition and opportunity proved irresistible. Serving an entire tribe would bring far more prestige and security than remaining with a single family. The young Levite's heart was glad at the prospect of advancement, and he readily agreed to accompany the Danites. Taking the ephod, household gods, and carved image with him, the priest joined the migration toward Laish. He had abandoned his employer without notice, stolen religious artifacts, and allied himself with raiders, all in pursuit of better career prospects. Meanwhile, Micah discovered the theft and organized his neighbors to pursue the thieves. The loss of his religious system represented more than material damage. It threatened his sense of security and divine favor that the shrine had provided. With men from his area, Micah caught up with the slower-moving Danite migration. "What's the matter with you, that you called out your men to fight?" the Danites asked when they saw him approaching with armed support. Micah's response revealed the depth of his spiritual confusion. "You took the gods I made and my priest and went away," he protested. "What else do I have? How can you ask what's the matter with me?" He called the stolen idols gods without apparent recognition of the contradiction. The Danite response was brutally practical. "Don't argue with us, or some of the men may get angry and attack you, and your family will lose your lives." They had superior numbers and were prepared to use violence to protect their theft. Faced with overwhelming force, Micah realized the futility of resistance. He turned back toward home, having lost both his religious system and his priest to raiders who cared nothing for justice or property rights. The Danites continued northward to Laish, where they found the people living exactly as the scouts had reported, peacefully and unsuspecting. The attack was swift and merciless. They put the city to the sword and burned it down, destroying a prosperous community that had offered them no provocation. Rebuilding the city according to their own preferences, they renamed it Dan after their tribal ancestor. The settlement became their northern stronghold, far from Philistine pressure and rich in agricultural potential. Most significantly, they set up the stolen idols as the centerpiece of their new religious system. Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, became their priest, establishing a hereditary priesthood that would serve the idolatrous shrine for generations. The irony was profound. The grandson of Moses, the great lawgiver who had received the commandments forbidding idol worship, now served as priest to stolen gods in a city built on violence and theft. The spiritual degradation of Israel had reached depths that previous generations could never have imagined. Dan's northern shrine became a permanent fixture in Israel's religious landscape, competing with the legitimate sanctuary at Shiloh. Pilgrims would travel to Dan for religious ceremonies, believing they were worshipping Israel's God through methods he had explicitly forbidden. The story reveals how quickly pragmatic concerns can override covenant faithfulness when central authority weakens. The Danites needed land, found a target, sought religious validation through improper channels, stole religious artifacts, and established an alternative worship system, all while believing they served Israel's God faithfully. Their success seemed to validate their methods. The new city prospered, the religious shrine attracted worshippers, the tribe found security and prosperity in their northern territory. External circumstances suggested divine blessing on their enterprise. Yet the fundamental spiritual reality remained unchanged. Theft could not be sanctified by religious ceremony. Violence could not be justified by practical need. And false worship could not honor the true God, regardless of sincere intentions or material prosperity. The establishment of Dan's idolatrous shrine marked a crucial step in Israel's spiritual decline. What had begun with Micah's private religious confusion had now become a tribal institution that would influence northern Israel's worship practices for centuries to come. The Levite's concubine, horror in Gibeah. In those dark days, when Israel had no king and moral boundaries seemed to dissolve like morning mist, a story unfolded that would shock the nation into unprecedented action. It began in the hill country of Ephraim, where a Levite lived with his concubine who had come from Bethlehem in Judah. The relationship between the Levite and his concubine had grown troubled over time. Whether through unfaithfulness, personality conflicts, or other domestic disputes, tensions had reached a breaking point. The woman left her partner's house and returned to her father's home in Bethlehem, seeking refuge and time to decide her future. 4 months passed in this separation. The Levite, perhaps realizing his own contribution to their problems, decided to pursue reconciliation. Taking along his servant and a pair of donkeys, he traveled south to Bethlehem to speak kindly to his concubine and persuade her to return with him. The woman's father welcomed his son-in-law warmly, showing hospitality that suggested genuine affection for the man despite the domestic troubles. Ancient Middle Eastern customs emphasized gracious treatment of guests, especially family members seeking to resolve personal conflicts. Day after day, the father urged the Levite to stay longer, extending his visit through generous meals and comfortable accommodations. Perhaps he hoped extended time together would heal whatever wounds had developed between the couple. Perhaps he simply enjoyed having company and conversation with his daughter's partner. On the fifth day, when the Levite finally insisted on departing, the father pressed them to delay until afternoon. "Refresh yourself. Wait till this evening," he urged, noting that the day was almost gone. Travel after dark on ancient roads was dangerous, and he genuinely cared for their safety. But the Levite was determined to travel, unwilling to spend another night. He loaded his donkeys, gathered his servant and concubine, and set out toward the hill country of Ephraim. As evening shadows lengthened across the landscape, as darkness approached, they found themselves near Jebus, the city that would later become Jerusalem. The servant suggested spending the night there, but the Levite refused. "We won't go into a foreign city whose people are not Israelites," he decided. He preferred to reach a city inhabited by his own people. The irony of this decision would become tragically apparent. The Levite trusted fellow Israelites more than foreigners, assuming covenant relationship guaranteed decent treatment. His logic seemed sound. Surely God's people would show proper hospitality to a traveling Levite and his household. Pressing onward in the gathering darkness, they reached Gibeah, a city belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. They sat in the city square waiting for someone to offer the hospitality that travelers could normally expect in Israelite towns. But no one invited them into their home. As full darkness settled over the city, an old man returning from work in the fields noticed the travelers. He was not originally from Gibeah, but had come from the hill country of Ephraim, making him technically a foreigner in Benjamin's territory, like the Levite himself. "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" the old man asked, showing interest in their situation. When the Levite explained their journey from Bethlehem toward Ephraim, the old man's heart was moved to compassion. "You are welcome at my house," he offered immediately. "Let me supply whatever you need. Only don't spend the night in the square." The warning proved prophetic. The old man understood something about Gibeah's moral climate that the Levite had not grasped. The city square was no place for vulnerable travelers after dark, especially when accompanied by women. The old man brought them into his house with genuine warmth. He provided food for the donkeys, washing water for their feet, and a meal for the travelers. The atmosphere seemed peaceful and secure as they settled in for the night. But as they were enjoying the meal and relaxing from their journey, sounds of trouble began outside. Voices grew louder and more demanding. Footsteps multiplied around the house. Someone pounded on the door with increasing force. "Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have relations with him," the crowd demanded. Their intentions were unmistakably evil, echoing the ancient wickedness of Sodom that had brought divine judgment generations earlier. The old man was horrified by their demands. Going outside to confront the crowd, he pleaded with them to abandon their evil intentions. "No, my friends, don't be so vile," he begged. "Since this man is my guest, don't do this outrageous thing." In his desperation to protect his guest, the old man made an offer that reveals the moral confusion of the era. "Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine," he said. "I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But to this man, don't do such an outrageous thing." The proposal reflected ancient codes of hospitality that prioritize guest protection over family welfare. But it also revealed how completely the value of women had been degraded in Israel's moral decline. The old man would sacrifice his own daughter to protect male honor. The crowd refused his alternative offering, continuing to demand the Levite himself. Their persistence and growing violence suggested the situation would end badly, regardless of any negotiations or compromises. Unable to reason with the mob, the Levite made a decision that would haunt Israel's memory for generations. He took his concubine and thrust her outside to the waiting crowd, abandoning her to their violence to save himself from assault. What followed was an act of collective brutality that defied description. The men of Gibeah abused the woman throughout the night, treating her with inhuman cruelty until dawn began to break over the city. As morning light appeared, they finally released her, and she made her way back to the house where her partner was staying. But the night's trauma had taken a fatal toll. She collapsed at the doorway, her hand reaching toward the threshold in a final gesture of desperate hope for safety. When morning came, the Levite rose to continue his journey, apparently unaware of what had transpired outside during the night. Opening the door to depart, he found his concubine fallen at the entrance, her hands on the threshold where she had died seeking refuge. "Get up, let's go," he said to the motionless form, as if she were merely sleeping late. But when she did not respond, the terrible reality became clear. The woman was dead, her life ended by the violence of men who shared his covenant faith. The Levite's response revealed the depth of moral callousness that had infected Israel. Rather than mourning her death or seeking justice through proper legal channels, he loaded her body onto his donkey and continued toward home as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But once he reached his house, the Levite committed an act that shocked even that brutal age. Taking a knife, he cut his concubine's body into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent the pieces throughout Israel's tribal territories. Each tribe received a portion of the dismembered body, along with the story of Gibeah's wickedness. The gruesome message could not be ignored or forgotten. Everyone who saw it was appalled, saying, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt." The Levite's strategy proved devastatingly effective. The horror of receiving human remains by messenger forced every Israelite community to confront the moral crisis that had been festering in their midst. The woman's death became a symbol of how far their nation had fallen from covenant faithfulness. Throughout Israel's territories, the same conversation repeated as tribal leaders examined the evidence and heard the accompanying testimony. "Consider it, take counsel, and speak up" became the cry as communities struggled to process the unprecedented atrocity. The crime at Gibeah represented more than individual wickedness. It revealed the complete breakdown of social order and moral restraint that characterized Israel during the Judges era. A city inhabited by God's covenant people had behaved worse than pagan Sodom, abusing a guest and causing innocent death. More troubling still was the response of supposedly righteous men to the crisis. The old man had offered his own daughter to protect his guest. The Levite had abandoned his concubine to save himself, then mutilated her corpse to achieve political objectives. None of the men involved had shown true moral courage when tested. The woman herself remained nameless throughout the account, identified only by her relationships to the men who controlled her life. Her voice was never heard, her perspective never considered. She became a symbol of the powerless victims created by a society that had abandoned divine standards for human convenience. Yet through her death, this anonymous woman became the catalyst for Israel's most significant internal conflict since entering the Promised Land. Her dismembered body would unite the tribes in unprecedented military action and force them to confront the logical consequences of their spiritual apostasy. The story of the Levite's concubine stands as perhaps the darkest chapter in the book of Judges, revealing how completely Israel had abandoned the moral vision God intended for his people. In a nation called to be a light to surrounding peoples, covenant communities had sunk below pagan standards of basic human decency. The horror at Gibeah would not be forgotten or forgiven easily. The tribes of Israel were about to engage in civil war that would nearly destroy one of their own number. The woman who died at dawn in Benjamin's territory had become, through her suffering and her partner's brutal response, the unwitting trigger for national crisis. Civil war and the collapse of a nation. The gruesome message sent by the Levite achieved exactly what he intended. Throughout Israel's tribal territories, the dismembered remains sparked outrage and horror that transcended normal political divisions. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the southern desert, the covenant people responded with unprecedented unity. The crime at Gibeah demanded justice. But more than that, it required corporate response to moral corruption that threatened Israel's very identity as God's chosen people. If such wickedness could flourish unchecked in a covenant city, what hope remained for the nation's spiritual future? Representatives from every tribe except Benjamin gathered at Mizpah, creating the largest assembly in Israel's history since the conquest under Joshua. 400,000 fighting men came armed and ready for war, their faces grim with determination to cleanse this evil from their midst. The Levite stood before this massive congregation to present his case. His account emphasized Benjamin's wickedness while carefully omitting details of his own cowardice. "The citizens of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house," he testified. "They intended to harm me, but instead they raped my concubine and she died." His edited version of events portrayed him as an innocent victim rather than a man who had abandoned his partner to save himself. But the assembled tribes cared less about his personal failings than about the corporate shame that Gibeah's wickedness had brought upon all Israel. "So I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance," the Levite continued, "because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel." His mutilation of her corpse was presented as righteous indignation rather than calculated political manipulation. The response from the assembled multitude was immediate and unanimous. "None of us will go home," they declared with one voice. "No, not one of us will return to his house." The horror had created solidarity that transcended tribal boundaries and personal interests. Their military strategy reflected both careful planning and divine guidance sought through proper channels. "Now, this is what we'll do to Gibeah," they announced. "We'll go up against it in the order decided by casting lots." Unlike recent examples of unauthorized religious consultation, they sought God's direction through legitimate means. The logistics of supporting such a massive force required sophisticated organization. "We'll take 10 men out of every 100 from all the tribes of Israel, and 100 from 1,000, and 1,000 from 10,000 to get provisions for the army." The campaign would be sustained through coordinated tribal support rather than individual initiative. Before launching their attack, the assembled tribes sent messengers throughout Benjamin's territory demanding justice. "What about this awful crime that was committed among you?" they asked. "Now turn those wicked men of Gibeah over to us, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." The request was reasonable and offered Benjamin opportunity to distance themselves from Gibeah's crime. By surrendering the guilty parties, they could demonstrate covenant faithfulness and avoid broader conflict. The other tribes genuinely hoped for peaceful resolution through proper justice. But Benjamin's response revealed how deeply tribal loyalty had corrupted moral judgment. Rather than investigating the charges or demanding accountability from Gibeah, they rallied to defend their kinsmen regardless of guilt or innocence. The Benjamites would not listen to their fellow Israelites, the biblical account records with obvious regret. Tribal pride overcame covenant obligation, creating the conditions for civil war that would devastate both sides. Benjamin's military response was swift and impressive. From their towns, they mustered 26,000 swordsmen, supplemented by 700 chosen men from Gibeah itself, the very city whose wickedness had sparked the crisis. These 700 Gibeahites possessed remarkable skill with slings, each one able to sling a stone at a hair and not miss. Their precision represented years of training and natural talent that would make them formidable opponents despite their numerical disadvantage. The contrast in numbers seemed overwhelming. 400,000 Israelites against 26,000 Benjamites. But David's later victory over Goliath would demonstrate that numerical superiority means little when God's favor rests elsewhere. Before beginning hostilities, the assembled tribes sought divine guidance about battle order. Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Benjamites? They inquired through proper religious channels at Bethel, where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. "Judah shall go first," came the divine response, echoing the leadership role that tribe had played since Jacob's blessing generations earlier. With God's direction secured, the massive army moved against Benjamin's positions with confidence in their righteous cause. The first battle took place near Gibeah, where Benjamin's forces waited in defensive positions. Despite their overwhelming numerical advantage, the attacking Israelites suffered shocking defeat. 22,000 of their warriors fell in a single day, their bodies littering the battlefield. The massive casualty count stunned the surviving Israelites. How could God allow such devastation to fall on those seeking justice for covenant violation? Their confidence in quick victory evaporated, replaced by grief and confusion about divine purposes. That evening, the remnant of Israel's army went up to Bethel to weep before the Lord. Their tears flowed from genuine sorrow over fallen comrades and profound bewilderment about God's apparent opposition to their righteous cause. "Shall we go up again to fight against the Benjamites, our fellow Israelites?" they asked through the high priest. The question revealed both determination to continue and uncertainty about divine support for their mission. "Go up against them," the Lord replied, providing encouragement to persist despite the initial setback. Divine purposes sometimes require testing and refinement that human understanding cannot immediately grasp. The second battle brought another devastating defeat. 18,000 more Israelites fell before Benjamin's swords and slings, their blood soaking the ground near Gibeah. The total casualties now exceeded 40,000 men from the larger force. This second disaster drove the surviving Israelites to desperate prayer and fasting. They came to Bethel and sat weeping before God, refusing food until evening, as they sought to understand why their righteous cause was meeting with such judgment. Their offerings that day included both burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, demonstrating repentance, along with requests for divine favor. Perhaps they were beginning to recognize their own sins alongside Benjamin's wickedness. Phinehas, son of Eleazar, served as high priest during this crisis, representing the legitimate religious authority that Micah's hired Levite and Dan's stolen priest had abandoned. Through him, the people inquired once more about continuing their military campaign. "Shall I go up again to fight against the Benjamites, my fellow Israelites, or not?" they asked, with voices hoarse from weeping and hearts heavy with doubt about their mission's righteousness. This time God's response included a promise of victory. "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." The assurance came after 2 days of devastating defeat had humbled Israel's pride and forced them to examine their own spiritual condition. The third battle employed different tactics based on lessons learned from previous defeats. Rather than relying solely on numerical superiority, the Israelites used strategic deception reminiscent of Joshua's victory at Ai generations earlier. They arranged ambush forces around Gibeah while the main army approached openly, drawing Benjamin's defenders out of their fortified positions. When the Benjamites pursued what appeared to be another retreating force, the hidden troops struck from behind. The strategy worked perfectly. Caught between converging forces with their escape routes cut off, Benjamin's army faced annihilation. The biblical account describes the devastating completeness of their defeat. All the Benjamites who fell that day were 25,000 swordsmen, all of them valiant fighters. Only 600 Benjamite warriors escaped the slaughter, fleeing to the Rock of Rimmon, where they remained for 4 months. The rest of Benjamin's fighting force was destroyed along with their cities, livestock, and everything else the Israelite army encountered. The victorious tribes showed no mercy in their campaign of destruction. The men of Israel went back to Benjamin and put all the towns to the sword, including the animals and everything else they found. All the towns they came across, they set on fire. This total warfare reflected both righteous anger over Gibeah's crime and troubling bloodthirst that exceeded divine requirements for justice. The line between legitimate punishment and vengeful destruction had become blurred in the heat of civil conflict. When the campaign ended, Benjamin, as a functioning tribe, had essentially ceased to exist. Their territory lay in ruins, their population decimated, their future uncertain. The price of defending wickedness and refusing accountability had proven catastrophic, but the cost to the other tribes was also enormous. 40,000 of their warriors had died in the 3 battles, leaving countless families without fathers, sons, and brothers. The civil war had weakened all of Israel, not just the guilty tribe. More troubling still was the realization that they had nearly exterminated one of their own tribes through collective punishment that exceeded the original crime's scope. The horror at Gibeah had been answered by horror on a much larger scale. The victory felt hollow as its implications became clear. Israel had purged the immediate evil from their midst, but at enormous cost in blood and treasure. The cure had proven almost as destructive as the disease it was meant to treat. As smoke rose from burning Benjamite cities and survivors counted their losses, uncomfortable questions emerged. Had justice been served, or had righteous anger become unrighteous vengeance? Had God's people shown his character to the world, or had they revealed their own capacity for brutality? The Civil War's conclusion would force Israel to grapple with these questions while confronting an unexpected crisis. In their zeal to punish Benjamin's wickedness, they had created new problems that would test their wisdom and compassion in ways they had not anticipated. The woman who died at Gibeah's threshold had become the catalyst for Israel's largest internal conflict. Her suffering had exposed the moral rot threatening their covenant identity. But the response to that suffering had revealed additional depths of brutality that called into question whether any true righteousness remained in the land. The final crisis and the end of hope. The aftermath of civil war brought Israel face to face with an unexpected crisis that revealed the true cost of their righteous vengeance. In their zeal to punish Benjamin's wickedness, the 11 tribes had created a problem that threatened to complete the destruction they had begun in battle. Before the war started, the assembled tribes had taken a solemn oath at Mizpah. Not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. The vow seemed reasonable at the time, expressing their horror at Gibeah's crime and their determination to isolate the guilty tribe completely. But now, with Benjamin's population devastated and only 600 men surviving at the Rock of Rimmon, the implications of that oath became clear. Without wives, these survivors could not rebuild their tribe. One of Israel's 12 tribes, descended from Jacob's beloved son, would disappear forever from the covenant community. The people came to Bethel and sat before God until evening, weeping loudly as the reality sank in. "Lord God of Israel," they cried, "why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today?" Their lament revealed both genuine grief and a troubling failure to accept responsibility for their own choices. They had demanded total war against Benjamin. They had sworn never to intermarry with the survivors. They had pursued vengeance beyond what justice required. Yet they spoke as if these outcomes had happened without their participation. The next morning brought attempts at religious solution to their self-created problem. They built an altar and offered burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, seeking divine intervention to resolve the crisis their own actions had caused. But their religious activity could not undo the practical consequences of their oath. The 600 Benjamite survivors remained hidden at Rimmon, unable to rebuild their tribe because no other Israelite families would provide wives for their sons. Then someone remembered another oath that might provide a solution. "Is there anyone from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah?" they asked. They had sworn that anyone who failed to participate in the gathering would be put to death. Investigation revealed that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to Mizpah during the crisis. The city had failed to support the righteous cause against Benjamin, making its inhabitants liable to the death penalty the assembled tribes had decreed. The discovery offered a terrible opportunity. If they destroyed Jabesh Gilead and spared only the virgin women, those survivors could become wives for some of the remaining Benjamites. The plan would provide wives while punishing another group for covenant disloyalty. 12,000 fighting men were dispatched to Jabesh Gilead with explicit instructions. "Go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the sword, including the women and children. This is what you are to do. Every male and every woman who has slept with a man must be put to death." The massacre at Jabesh Gilead yielded 400 virgin women who were brought back as potential wives for the Benjamite survivors. But even this brutal solution was inadequate. 600 men needed wives, and only 400 had been obtained through violence. The elders of the community struggled with the mathematical shortfall. With the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? They wondered. Their oath prevented them from giving their own daughters, and they had exhausted other sources through warfare. Someone proposed another solution that revealed how completely moral reasoning had collapsed. The annual festival at Shiloh was approaching when young women traditionally participated in celebratory dances. The remaining Benjamites could hide in the vineyards and kidnap wives from among the dancers. Go and hide in the vineyards and watch. The elders instructed the 200 men still without wives. When the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each of you seize one of them to be your wife, then return to the land of Benjamin. The plan included a justification for the fathers and brothers of the kidnapped women. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, "Do us the kindness of helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. And you are innocent, since you did not give your daughters to them." The twisted logic attempted to preserve everyone's honor while violating basic principles of consent and family authority. The women would be kidnapped, but their families could claim innocence of oath-breaking since they had not voluntarily given their daughters in marriage. The plan was executed exactly as designed. During Shiloh's festival, when young women emerged to participate in traditional dances, the hidden Benjamites rushed from their concealment and seized wives from among the unsuspecting celebrants. Each man carried off a woman to be his wife, returning to Benjamin's territory to begin the slow work of rebuilding their devastated tribe. The women, torn from their families and communities, became unwilling partners in a restoration project built on violence and theft. The kidnapping at Shiloh completed Israel's moral descent during the Judges era. What had begun with individual compromises and unauthorized religious innovations had culminated in corporate sanctioning of mass abduction. The people who claimed to serve the God of justice had become perpetrators of systematic injustice. The surviving Benjamites rebuilt their towns and began repopulating their territory. Their children would grow up hearing stories of the Great Civil War and the creative methods used to provide their mothers. The trauma would echo through generations, shaping tribal identity and relationships. Israel's other tribes returned to their territories, having solved their immediate problem through methods that created new moral complications. The kidnapped women would bear children whose mothers had been stolen, creating families founded on violence rather than love or mutual consent. The Book of Judges concludes with an observation that explains everything that has preceded it. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The repeated phrase summarizes not just the final chapters, but the entire era of moral decay and spiritual apostasy. The judges who had begun as emergency deliverers, raised up by God to rescue his people, had evolved into dynastic aristocrats more concerned with personal power than covenant faithfulness. Religious worship had devolved into private shrines, hired priests, and stolen idols that bore no relationship to the true God's requirements. Social order had collapsed to the point where covenant cities behaved worse than pagan Sodom, where civil war nearly destroyed entire tribes, and where mass kidnapping was considered an acceptable solution to self-created problems. The people called to be a light to the nations had become a cautionary tale of moral failure. Yet even in this darkness, hints of hope remained. God had not abandoned his covenant people entirely. The same divine power that had raised up judges in earlier crises could work again if Israel turned back to him with genuine repentance and faith. The stage was set for the next phase of Israel's history. The chaos of the Judges era had demonstrated the inadequacy of human solutions to spiritual problems. The people would soon cry out for a king like other nations, seeking political solutions to their moral crisis. But the real need went deeper than governmental structure. What Israel required was a return to covenant faithfulness, a genuine recognition that their God demanded exclusive loyalty and moral obedience. Until that spiritual foundation was restored, no human leader could provide the stability and righteousness they desperately needed. The anonymous woman who died at Gibeah's threshold had become a symbol of how far God's people had fallen. The children born to kidnapped mothers at Shiloh would grow up in the world her death had helped create. Both represented the human cost of a nation that had forgotten its calling and abandoned its God. The book of Judges ends not with victory or restoration, but with moral exhaustion and spiritual bankruptcy. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, and the result was chaos, violence, and systematic injustice disguised as religious devotion. Israel's experiment with decentralized leadership had failed completely. The time of judges was ending, and the age of kings was about to begin. But the underlying spiritual problems that had created the chaos would not disappear with new political structures. They would require deeper solutions that only God Himself could provide.